Part 4. Throughout September and October, the town lay prostrate, at the mercy of the plague. There was nothing to do but to mark time, and some hundreds of thousands of men and women went on doing this, through weeks that seemed interminable. Mists, heat, and rain rang their changes in our streets. From the south came silent convoys of starlings and thrushes, flying very high but always giving the town a wide berth, as though the strange implement of the plague described by Penelot. The giant flail whirling and shrilling over the housetops warned them off us. At the beginning of October, torrents of rain swept the houses clean, and all the time, nothing more important fell us than that multitudinous marking time. It was now that Ryu and his friends came to realize how exhausted they were. Indeed, the workers in the sanitary squads had given up trying to cope with their fatigue. Ryu noticed the change coming over his associates, and himself as well, and it took the form of a strange indifference to everything. Men, for instance, who hitherto had shown a keen interest in every scrap of news concerning the plague, now displayed none at all. Rambert, who had been temporarily put in charge of a quarantine station, his hotel had been taken over for this purpose, could state at any moment the exact number of persons under his observation, and every detail of the procedure he had laid down for the prompt evacuation of those who suddenly developed symptoms of their family was firmly fixed in his mind. The same was true of the statistics of the effect of anti-plague inoculations on the people in his quarantine station. Nevertheless, he could not have told you the week's total of plague deaths, and he could not even have said if the figure was rising or falling. And meanwhile, in spite of everything, he had not lost hope of being able to make his getaway from one day to another. As for the others, working themselves almost to a standstill throughout the day and far into the night, they never bothered to read the newspaper or listen to the radio. When told of some unlooked-for recovery, they made a show of interest, but actually received the news with the stolid indifference that we may imagine the fighting man in a great war to feel, who, worn out by the incessant strain and mindful only of the duties daily assigned to him, has ceased even to hope for the decisive battle or the burgle call of armistice. Though he still worked out methodically the figures related to the plague, Grand would certainly have been quite unable to say to what they pointed. Unlike Ryu, Rambert, and Tarot, who obviously had great powers of endurance, he had never had good health. And now, in addition to his duties at the municipal office, he had his night work and his secretarial post under Ryu. One could see that the strain was telling on him, and if he managed to keep going, it was thanks to 2 or 3 fixed ideas, one of which was to take, the moment the plague ended, a complete vacation, of a week at least, which he would devote, hats off, to his work in progress. He was also becoming subject to excesses of sentimentality, and at such times would unburden himself to Ryu about Jian. Where was she now, he wondered. Did her thoughts sometimes turn to him when she read the papers? It was Grand to whom one day Ryu caught himself talking, much to his own surprise, about his wife, and in the most commonplace terms, something he has never done as yet to anyone. Doubtful how far he could trust his wife's telegrams, their tone was always reassuring. He had decided to wire the house physician of the sanatorium. The reply informed him that her condition had worsened, but everything was being done to arrest further progress of the disease. He had kept the news to himself so far, and could only put it down to his nervous exhaustion that he passed it on to Grand. After talking to the doctor about Jian, Grand had asked some questions about Mrs. Ryu, and on hearing Ryu's reply, said, "You know, it's wonderful, the cures they bring off nowadays." Ryu agreed, merely adding that the long separation was beginning to tell on him, and, what was more, he might have helped his wife to make a good recovery, whereas, as things were, she must be feeling terribly lonely. After which he fell silent, and gave only evasive answers to Grand's further questions. The others were in much the same state. Tarot held his own better, but the entries in his diary show that while his curiosity had kept its depth, it had lost its diversity. Indeed, throughout the period the only person, apparently, who really interested him was Courtard. In the evening, at Ryu's apartment, where he had come to live now that the hospital was requisitioned as a quarantine center, he paid little or no attention to Grand and the doctor when they read over the day's statistics. At the earliest opportunity, he switched the conversation over to his pet subject, small details of the daily life at Iran. More perhaps than any of them, Dr. Castell showed signs of wear and tear. On the day when he came to tell Ryu that the anti-plague serum was ready, and they decided to try it for the first time on M. Othin's small son, whose case seemed all but hopeless, Ryu suddenly noticed, while he was announcing the latest statistics, that Castell was slumped in his chair, sound asleep. The difference in his old friend's face shocked him. The smile of benevolent irony that always played on it had seemed to endow it with perpetual youth, now abruptly left out of control, with a trickle of saliva between his slightly parted lips. It betrayed its age and the wastage of the years. And seeing this, Ryu felt a lump come to his throat. It was by such lapses that Ryu could gauge his exhaustion. His sensibility was getting out of hand. Kept under all the time, it had grown hard and brittle and seemed to snap completely now and then, leaving him the prey of his emotions. No resource was left him but to tighten the stranglehold on his feelings, and harden his heart protectively. For he knew this was the only way of carrying on. In any case, he had few illusions left, and fatigue was robbing him of even these remaining few. He knew that, over a period whose end he could not glimpse, his task was no longer to cure, but to diagnose, to detect, to see, to transcribe, to register, and then condemn. That was his present function. Sometimes a woman would clutch his sleeve, crying shrilly, "Doctor, you'll save him, won't you?" But he wasn't there for saving life. He was there to order a sick man's evacuation. How futile was the hatred he saw in faces then. "You haven't a heart," a woman told him on one occasion. She was wrong. He had one. It was him through his 20-hour day, when he hourly watched men dying who were meant to live. It enabled him to start anew each morning. He had just enough heart for that, as things were now. How could that heart have sufficed for saving life? No, it wasn't medical aid that he dispensed on those crowded days, only information. Obviously, that could hardly be reckoned a man's job. Yet, when all was said and done, who, in that terror-stricken, decimated populace, had scope for any activity worthy of his manhood? Indeed, for Ryu his exhaustion was a blessing in disguise. Had he been less tired, his senses more alert, that all-pervading odor of death might have made him sentimental. But when a man has had only 4 hours sleep, he isn't sentimental. He sees things as they are. That is to say, he sees them in the garish light of justice, hideous, witless justice. And those others, the men and women under sentence for death, shared his bleak enlightenment. Before the plague, he was welcomed as a savior. He was going to make them right with a couple of pills or an injection, and people took him by the arm on his way to the sick room. Flattering, but dangerous. Now, on the contrary, he was accompanied by soldiers, and they had to hammer on the door with rifle butts before the family would open it. They would have liked to drag the whole human race with them to the grave. Yes, it was quite true that men can't do without their fellow men. That he was as helpless as these unhappy people, and he, too, deserved the same faint thrill of pity that he allowed himself once he had left them. Such, anyhow, were the thoughts that in those endless-seeming weeks ran in the doctor's mind, along with thoughts about his severance from his wife. And such, too, were his friends' thoughts, judging by the look he saw on their faces. But the most dangerous effect of the exhaustion steadily gaining on all engaged in the fight against the epidemic did not consist in their relative indifference to outside events and to the feelings of others, but in the slackness and supineness that they allowed to invade their personal lives. They developed a tendency to shirk every moment that didn't seem absolutely necessary, or called for efforts that seemed too great to be worthwhile. Thus these men were led to break, oftener and oftener, the rules of hygiene they themselves had instituted, to omit some of the numerous disinfections that they should have practiced, and sometimes visit the homes of people suffering from pneumonic plague without taking steps to safeguard themselves against infection, because they had been notified only at the last moment, and could not be bothered with returning to a sanitary service station, sometimes a considerable distance away, to have the necessary installations. There lay the real danger, for the energy they devoted to righting the disease made them all the more liable to it. In short, they were gambling on their luck, and luck is not to be coerced. There was, however, one man in the town who seemed neither exhausted nor discouraged. Indeed, the living image of contentment. It was Quartard. Though maintaining contact with Ryu and Rambert, he still kept rather aloof, whereas he deliberately cultivated Tarot, seeing him as often as Tarot's scantily leisure permitted. He had two reasons for this. One, that Tarot knew all about his case, and the other, that he always gave him a cordial welcome and made him feel at ease. That was one of the remarkable things about Tarot. No matter how much work he had put in, he was always a ready listener and an agreeable companion. Even when, some evenings, he seemed completely worn out, the next day brought him a new lease of energy. "Tarot's a fellow one can talk to," Courtauld once told Rambert. "Because he's really human. He always understands." This may explain why the entries in Tarot's diary of this period tend to converge on Courtaud's personality. It is obvious that Tarot was attempting to give a full-length picture of the man, and noted all his reactions and reflections, whether as conveyed to him by Courtauld or interpreted by himself. Under the heading, Courtauld and his relations with the plague, we find a series of notes covering several pages, and in the narrator's opinion, these are well worth summarizing here. One of the entries gives Tarot's general impression of Courtauld at this time. He is blossoming out, expanding in geniality and in good humor. For Courtauld was anything but upset by the turn of events were taking. Sometimes in Tarot's company, he voiced his true feelings in remarks of this order. "Getting worse every day, isn't it? Well, anyhow, everyone's in the same boat." "Obviously," Tarot comments. "He's in the same peril of death as everyone else, but that's just the point. He's in it with the others. And then I'm pretty sure he doesn't seriously think he runs much personal risk. He has got the idea into his head, apparently, and perhaps it's not so far-fetched as it seems, that a man suffering from a dangerous ailment or grave anxiety is allergic to other ailments and anxieties. Have you noticed, he asked me, that no one ever runs two diseases at once? Let's suppose you have an incurable disease like cancer or galloping consumption. Well, you'll never get plague or typhus, it's a physical impossibility. In fact, one might go farther. Have you ever heard of a man with cancer being killed in an auto smash? This theory, for what it's worth, keeps Courtauld cheerful. The thing he'd most detest is being cut off from others. He'd rather be one of a beleaguered crowd than a prisoner alone. The plague has put an effective stop to police inquiries, sleuthings, warrants of arrest, and so forth. Come to that, we have no police nowadays. No crime past nor present, no more criminals, only condemned men hoping for the most capricious of pardons. And among these are the police themselves. Thus Courtauld, if we may trust Tarot's diagnosis, had good grounds for viewing the symptoms of mental confusion and distress in those around him with an understanding and an indulgent satisfaction that might have found expression in the remark, "Prate away, my friends, but I had it first." When I suggested to him, Tarot continues, that the surest way of not being cut off from others was having a clean conscience, he frowned. If that is so, everyone's always cut off from everybody else. And a moment later, he added, Say what you like, Tarot, but let me tell you this. The one way of making people hang together is to give them a spell of plague. You've only got to look around you. Of course I see his point, and I understand how congenial our present mode of life must be to him. How could he fail to recognize at every turn reactions that were his? The efforts everyone makes to keep on the right side of other people. The obligingness sometimes shown in helping people who have lost his way. And the ill humor shown at other times, the way people flock to the luxury restaurants. Their pleasure at being there and their reluctance to leave. The crowds lining up daily at the picture houses, filling theaters and music halls and even dance halls, and flooding boisterously out into the squares and avenues. The shrinking from every contact, and notwithstanding, the craving for human warmth that urges people to one another, body to body, sex to sex. Courtauld has been through all that, obviously, with one exception. We may rule out women, in his case, with that mug of his, and I should say that when tempted to visit a brothel he refrains. It might give him a bad name and be held against him one day. In short, this epidemic has done him proud. Of a lonely man who hated loneliness, it has made an accomplice. Yes, accomplice is the word that fits. And doesn't he relish his complicity? He is happily at one with all around him, with their superstitions, their groundless panics, the susceptibilities of people whose nerves are always on the stretch. with their fixed idea of talking the least possible about plague and nevertheless talking of it all the time, with their abject terror at the slightest headache. Now they know headache to be an early symptom of the disease, and lastly, with their frayed, irritable sensibility that takes offense at trifling oversights and brings tears to their eyes over the loss of a trouser button. Thoreau often went out with Courtauld in the evening, and he describes how they would plunge together into the dark crowds filling the streets at nightfall, how they mingled, shoulder to shoulder, in the black and white moving mass lit here and there by the fitful gleam of a street lamp, and how they let themselves be swept along with the human herd toward resorts of pleasure, whose companionable warmth seemed a safeguard from the plague's cold breath. What Courtauld had some months previously been looking for in public places, luxury and the lavish life, the frenzied orgies he had dreamed of without being able to procure them, these were now the quest of a whole populace. Though prices soared inevitably, never had so much money been squandered, and while bare necessities were often lacking, never had so much been spent on superfluities. All the recreations of leisure, due though it now was to unemployment, multiplied 100-fold. Sometimes Thoreau and Courtauld would follow for some minutes one of those amorous couples who in the past would have tried to hide the passion drawing them to each other, but now, pressed closely to each other's side, paraded the streets among the crowd, with the trance-like self-absorption of great lovers, oblivious to the people around them. Courtauld watched them gloatingly. "Good work, my dears!" he had exclaimed. "Go to it!" Even his voice had changed, grown louder. As Thoreau wrote, he was blossoming out in the congenial atmosphere of mass excitement, fantastically large tips clanking on the cafe tables, love affairs shaping under his eyes. However, Thoreau seemed to detect little if any spitefulness in Courtauld's attitude. His "I've been through the mill myself" had more pity than triumph in it. "I suspect," Thoreau wrote, "that he's getting quite fond of those people shut up under their little patch of sky within their city walls. For instance, he'd like to explain to them, if he had a chance, that it isn't so terrible as all that. 'You hear them saying,' he told me, 'after the plague I'll do this or that.' They're eating their hearts out instead of staying put. And do they even realize their privilege? Take my case, I could say. After my arrest I'll do this or that. Arrest's a beginning, not an end, whereas plague. Do you know what I think? They're fretting simply because they won't let themselves go, and I know what I'm talking about." "Yes, he knows what he's talking about," Thoreau added. "He has an insight into the anomalies in the lives of the people here, who, though they have an instinctive craving for human contacts, can't bring themselves to yield to it, because of the mistrust that keeps them apart. For it's common knowledge that you can't trust your neighbor. He may pass the disease to you without your knowing it, and take advantage of a moment under inadvertence on your part to infect you. When one has spent one's days, as Courtauld has, seeing a possible police spy in everyone, even in persons he feels drawn to, it's easy to understand this reaction. One can have fellow feelings toward people who are haunted by the idea that when they least expect it, plague may lay its cold hand on their shoulders, and is, perhaps, about to do so at the very moment when one is congratulating oneself on being safe and sound. So far as this is possible, he is at ease under the reign of terror. But I suspect that, just because he has been through it before them, he can't wholly share with them the agony of this feeling of uncertainty that he never leaves them. It comes to this. Like all of us who have not yet died of plague, he fully realizes that his freedom and his life may be snatched from him at any moment. But since he, personally, has learned what it is to live in a state of constant fear, he finds it normal that others should come to know this state. Or perhaps it should be put like this. Fear seems to him more bearable under these conditions than it was he had to bear its burden alone. In this respect, he's wrong, and this makes him harder to understand than other people. Still, after all, that's why he is worth a greater effort to understand. Thoreau's notes end with a story illustrating the curious state of mind arrived at no less by Courtauld than by other dwellers in the plague-stricken town. This story recreates as nearly as may be the curiously feverish atmosphere of this period, and that is why the narrator attaches importance to it. One evening, Courtauld and Thoreau went to the municipal opera house, where Gluck's Orpheus was being given. Courtauld had invited Thoreau. A touring operatic company had come to Iran in the spring for a series of performances. Marooned there by the outbreak of plague and finding themselves in difficulties, the company and the management of the opera house had come to an agreement under which they were to give one performance a week until further notice. Thus, for several months, our theater had been resounding every Friday evening with the melodious laments of Orpheus and Eurydice's vain appeals. Nonetheless, the opera continued in high favor and played regularly to full houses. From their seats, the most expensive, Courtauld and Tarot could look down at the orchestra seats filled to capacity with the cream of Iran society. It was interesting to see how careful they were, as they went to their places, to make an elegant entrance. When the musicians were discreetly tuning up, men in evening dress could be seen moving from one row to another, bowing gracefully to friends under the flood of light bathing the proscenium. In the soft hum of well-mannered conversation, they regained the confidence denied them when they walked the dark streets of the town. Evening dress was a sure charm against plague. Throughout the first act, Orpheus lamented savagely his lost Eurydice, with women in Grecian tunics singing melodious comments on his plight, and love was hymned in alternating strophes. The audience showed their appreciation with discreet applause. Only a few people noticed that, in his song of the second act, Orpheus introduced some tremulous not in the score, and voiced an almost exaggerated emotion when begging the lord of the underworld to be moved by his tears. Some rather jerky movements he indulged in gave our connoisseurs of stagecraft an impression of clever, if slightly overdone, effects, intended to bring out the emotion of the words he sang. Not until the big duet between Orpheus and Eurydice in the third act, at the precise moment when Eurydice was slipping from her lover, did a flutter of surprise run through the house. And as though the singer had been waiting for this cue, or, more likely, because the faint sounds that came to him from the orchestra seats confirmed what he was feeling, he chose this moment to stagger grotesquely at the footlights, his arms and legs splayed under his antique robe, and fall down in the middle of the property sheepfold, always out of place, but now, in the eyes of the spectators, significantly, appallingly so. For at the same moment, the orchestra stopped playing. The audience rose and began to leave the auditorium, slowly and silently at first, like worshippers leaving church when the service ends, or a death chamber after a farewell visit to the dead. Women lifting their skirts and moving with bowed heads, men steering the ladies by the elbow to prevent their brushing against the tip-up seats at the end of the rows. But gradually, their movements quickened, whispers rose to exclamations, and finally, the crowd stampled toward the exits, wedged together in the bottlenecks, and pouring out into the streets in a confused mass, with shrill cries of dismay. Courtauld and Tarot, who had merely risen from their seats, gazed down at what was a dramatic picture of their life in those days. Plague on the stage in the guise of a disarticulated murmur, and in the auditorium the toys of luxury, so futile now, forgotten fans and lace strolls, derelict on the red plush seats. During the first part of September, Rambert had worked conscientiously at Ryu's side. He had merely asked for a few hours' leave on the day when he was due to meet Gonzalez and the two youngsters again outside the boys' school. Gonzalez kept the appointment, at noon, and while he and the journalist were talking, they saw the two boys coming toward them, laughing. They said they'd had no luck last time, but that was only to be expected. Anyhow, it wasn't their turn for guard duty this week. Rambert must have patience till next week, then they'd have another shot at it. Rambert observed that patience certainly was needed in this business. Gonzalez suggested that they should all meet again on the following Monday, and this time Rambert had better move in to stay with Marseille and Louis. "I'll make a date, you and I. If I don't turn up, go straight to their place. I'll give you the address." But Marseille, or Louis, told him that the safest place was to take his pal there right away. Then he'd be sure of finding it. If he wasn't too particular, there was enough grub for the four of them. That way, he'd get the hang of things. Gonzalez agreed it was a good idea, and the four of them set off toward the harbor. Marseille and Louis lived on the outskirts of the dockyard, near the gate leading to the cliff road. It was a small Spanish house with gaily painted shutters and bare, dark rooms. The boy's mother, a wrinkled old Spanish woman with a smiling face, produced a dish of which the chief ingredient was rice. Gonzalez showed surprise, as rice had been unprocurable for some time in the town. "We'll fix it up at the gate," Marseille explained. Rambert ate and drank heartily, and Gonzalez informed him that he was a damned good sort. Actually, the journalist was thinking solely of the coming week. It turned out that he had a fortnight to wait, as the periods of guard duty were extended to 2 weeks to reduce the number of shifts. During that fortnight, Rambert worked indefatigably, giving every ounce of himself, with his eyes shut, as it were, from dawn till night. He went to bed very late and always slept like a log. This abrupt transition from a life of idleness to one of constant work had left him almost void of thoughts or energy. He talked little about his impending escape. Only one incident is worth noting. After a week, he confessed to the doctor that for the first time he'd really gotten drunk. It was the evening before. On leaving the bar, he had an impression that his groin was swollen, and he had pains in his armpits when he moved his arms. "I'm in for it," he thought. And his only reaction, an absurd one, as he frankly admitted to Ryu, had been to start running to the upper town, and when he reached a small square, from which, if not the sea, a fairly big patch of open sky could be seen, to call to his wife with a great cry over the walls of the town. On returning home and failing to discover any symptoms of plague on his body, he had felt far from proud of having given way like that. Ryu, however, said he could well understand one's being moved to act thus. Or anyhow, one may easily feel inclined that way. Monsieur Orthon was talking to me about you this morning, Ryu suddenly remarked, when Rambert was bidding him good night. He asked me if I knew you, and I told him I did. Then he said, if he's a friend of yours, advise him not to associate with smugglers. It's bound to attract attention. Meaning what? It means you'd better hurry up. Thanks. Rambert shook the doctor's hand. In the doorway, he suddenly swung round. Ryu noticed that, for the first time since the outbreak of the plague, he was smiling. Then why don't you stop my going? You could easily manage it. Ryu shook his head with his usual deliberateness. It was none of his business, he said. Rambert was elected for happiness, and he, Ryu, had no argument to put up against him. Personally, he felt incapable of deciding which was the right course and which was wrong in such a case as Rambert's. If that's so, why tell me to hurry up? It was Ryu who now smiled. Perhaps because I, too, would like to do my bit for happiness. Next day, though they were working together for most of the time, neither referred to the subject. On the following Sunday, Rambert moved into the little Spanish house. He was given a bed in the living room, as the brothers did not come home for meals and he'd been told to go out as little as possible. He was always alone but for occasional meetings with the boy's mother. She was a dried-up little wisp of a woman, always dressed in black, busy as a bee, and she had a nut-brown, wrinkled face and immaculately white hair. No great talker, she merely smiled genially when her eyes fell on Rambert. On one of the few occasions when she spoke, it was to ask him if he wasn't afraid of infecting his wife with plague. He replied that there might be some risk of that, but only a very slight one, while if he stayed in the town, there was a fair chance of their never seeing each other again. The old woman smiled. Is she nice? Very nice. Pretty? I think so. Ah, she nodded. That explains it. Rambert reflected. No doubt that explained it, but it was impossible that that alone explained it. The old woman went to Mass every morning. Don't you believe in God? She asked him. On Rambert's admitting he did not, she said again that explained it. Yes, she added. You're right. You must go back to her. Or else what would be left you? Rambert spent most of the day prowling around the room, gazing vaguely at the distempered walls, idly fingering the fans that were their only decoration, or counting the wooden bowls on the tablecloth fringe. In the evening, the youngsters came home. They hadn't much to say, except that the time hadn't come yet. After dinner, Marseille played the guitar, and they drank an anise-flavored liqueur. Rambert seemed lost in thought. On Wednesday, Marseille announced, It's for tomorrow night, at midnight. Be ready on time. Of the two men sharing the sentry post with them, he explained, one had got plague and the other, who had slept in the same room, was now under observation. Thus, for 2 or 3 days, Marseille and Louis would be alone at the post. They'd fix up the final details in the course of the night, and he could count on them to see it through. Rambert thanked them. Pleased? The old woman asked. He said yes, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The next day was very hot and muggy, and a heat mist veiled the sun. The total number of deaths had jumped up, but the old Spanish woman lost nothing of her serenity. "There's so much sickness in the world," she said. "So what can you expect?" Like Marseille and Louis, Rambert was stripped to the waist, but even so, sweat was trickling down his chest and between his shoulder blades. In the dim light of the shuttered room, their torsos glowed like highly polished mahogany. Rambert kept prowling round like a caged animal, without speaking. Abruptly, at 4 in the afternoon, he announced that he was going out. "Don't forget," Marseille said. "At midnight sharp. Everything set." Rambert went to the doctor's apartment. Ryu's mother told him that he would find the doctor at the hospital in the upper town. As before, a crowd was circling in front of the entrance gates. "Move on there!" A police sergeant with bulging eyes bowled every few minutes. And the crowd kept moving, but always in a circle. "Now you's hanging around here." The sergeant's coat was soaked in sweat. They said it was no use, but they stayed on, despite the devastating heat. Rambert showed his pass to the sergeant, who told him to go to Tarot's office. Its door opened in the courtyard. He passed Father Panelot, who was coming out of the office. Tarot was sitting at a black wood desk, with his sleeves rolled up, mopping up with his handkerchief a trickle of sweat in the bend of his arm. The office, a small, white-painted room, smelt of drugs and damp cloth. "Still here?" asked Tarot. "Yes, I'd like to have a word with Ryu. He's in the ward. Look here. Don't you think you could fix up whatever you're come for without seeing him?" "Why? He's ever doing it. I spare him as much as I can." Rambert gazed thoughtfully at Tarot. He'd grown thinner. His eyes and features were blurred with fatigue. His broad shoulders sagged. There was a knock at the door. A male attendant, wearing a white mask, entered. He laid a little sheaf of cards on Tarot's desk, and, his voice coming thickly through the cloth, said, "6, then went out. Tarot looked at the journalist and showed him the cards, spreading them fanwise. "Neat little gadgets, aren't they? Well, they're deaths. Last night's deaths." Frowning, he slipped the cards together. "The only thing that's left us is accountancy." Taking his purchase on the table, Tarot rose to his feet. "You're off quite soon, I take it. Tonight, at midnight." Tarot said he was glad to hear it, and Rambert had better look after himself for a bit. "Did you say that? Sincerely?" Tarot shrugged his shoulders. "At my age, one's got to be sincere. Lying's too much effort." "Excuse me, Tarot," the journalist said, "but I'd greatly like to see the doctor." "I know. He's more human than I. All right, come along." "It's not that." Rambert stumbled over his words and broke off. Tarot stared at him, then, unexpectedly, his face broke into a smile. They walked down a narrow passage. The walls were painted pale green, and the light was glaucous, like that in an aquarium. Before they reached the glazed double door at the end of the passage, behind which shadowy forms could be seen moving, Tarot took Rambert into a small room, all the wall space of which was occupied by cupboards. Opening one of these, he took from a sterilizer 2 masks of cotton wool enclosed in muslin, handed one to Rambert, and told him to put it on. The journalist asked if it was really any use. Tarot said no, but it inspired confidence in others. They opened the glazed door. It led into a very large room, all of the windows of which were shut in spite of the great heat. Electric fans buzzed near the ceiling, turning up the stagnant, overheated air above 2 long rows of gray beds. Groans shrill or stifled rose on all sides, blending in a monotonous dirge-like refrain. Men in white moved slowly from bed to bed under the garish light flooding from in-high, barred windows. The appalling heat in the ward made Rambert ill at ease, and he had difficulty in recognizing Ryu, who was bending over a groaning form. The doctor was lancing the patient's groin, while 2 nurses, one on each side, held his legs apart. Presently, Ryu straightened up, dropped his instruments into a tray that an attendant had held out to him, and remained without moving for some moments, gazing down at the man, whose wound was now being dressed. "Any news?" he asked Tarot, who'd come beside him. "Panelot is prepared to replace Rambert at the quarantine station. He has put in a lot of useful work already." All that remains is to reorganize group number 3, now that Rambert's going. Ryu nodded. Castell made his first lot of serum already now, Taro continued. He's in favor of its being used at once. Good, Ryu said. That's good news. And Rambert's come. Ryu looked round. His eyes narrowed above the mask when he saw the journalist. Why have you come? He asked. Surely you should be elsewhere. Taro explained that it was fixed for midnight, to which Rambert added, That's the idea, anyhow. Whenever any of them spoke through the mask, the muslin bulged and grew moist over the lips. This gave a sort of unreality to the conversation. It was like a colloquy of statues. I'd like to have a word with you. Right, I'm just going. Wait for me in Taro's office. A minute or so later, Rambert and Ryu were sitting in the back of the doctor's car. Taro, who was at the wheel, looked around as he let in the gear. Gas is running out, he said. We'll have to foot slog it tomorrow. Doctor, Rambert said. I'm not going. I want to stay with you. Taro made no movement. He went on driving. Ryu seemed unable to shake off his fatigue. And what about her? His voice was hardly audible. Rambert said he thought it over carefully, and his views hadn't changed. But if he went away, he would feel ashamed of himself, and that would embarrass his relations with the woman he loved. Showing more animation, Ryu told him that was sheer nonsense. There was nothing shameful in preferring happiness. Certainly, Rambert replied, but it may be shameful to be happy by oneself. Taro, who had not spoken so far, now remarked, without turning his head, that if Rambert wanted to take a share in other people's unhappiness, he'd have no time left for happiness, so the choice had to be made. That's not it, Rambert rejoined. Until now I've always felt a stranger in this town, and that I had no concern with you people. But now that I've seen what I have seen, I know that I belong here whether I want it or not. This business is everybody's business. When there was no reply from either of the others, Rambert seemed to grow annoyed. But you know as well as I do, damn it. Or else what are you up to in that hospital of yours? Have you made a definite choice and turned down happiness? Ryu and Taro still said nothing, and the silence lasted until they were at the doctor's home. Then, Rambert repeated his last question in a yet more emphatic tone. Only then Ryu turned toward him, raising himself with an effort from the cushion. Forgive me, Rambert. Only, well, I simply don't know. But stay with us if you want to. A swerve of the car made him break off. Then, looking straight in front of him, he said, For nothing in the world is it worth turning one's back on what one loves. Yet that is what I'm doing, though why I do not know. He sank back on the cushion. That's how it is, he said wearily, and there's nothing to be done about it. So let's recognize the fact and draw the conclusions. What conclusions? Ah, Ryu said. A man can't cure and know at the same time. So let's cure as quickly as we can. That's the more urgent job. At midnight, Taro and Ryu were giving Rambert the map of the district he was to keep under surveillance. Taro glanced at his watch. Looking up, he met Rambert's gaze. Have you let them know? He asked. The journalist looked away. I'd sent them a note, he spoke with an effort, before coming to see you. Toward the close of October, Castell's anti-plague serum was tried for the first time. Practically speaking, it was Ryu's last card. If it failed, the doctor was convinced the whole town would be at the mercy of the epidemic, which would either continue its ravages for an unpredictable period, or perhaps die out abruptly of its own accord. The day before Castell called on Ryu, Othen's son had fallen ill, and all the family had to go into quarantine. Thus the mother, who had only recently come out of it, found herself isolated once again. In deference to the official regulations, the magistrate had promptly sent for Dr. Ryu the moment he saw symptoms of the disease in his little boy. Mother and father were standing at the bedside when Ryu entered the room. The boy was in the phase of extreme prostration, and submitted without a whimper to the doctor's examination. When Ryu raised his eyes, he saw the magistrate's gaze intent on him, and behind, the mother's pale face. She was holding a handkerchief to her mouth, and her big, dilated eyes followed each of the doctor's movements. He has it, I suppose, the doctor asked in a toneless voice. Yes. Ryu gazed down at the child again. The mother's eyes widened yet more, but she still said nothing. Othen, too, kept silent for a while before saying in an even lower tone, Well, doctor, we must do as we are told to do. Ryu avoided looking at Mrs. Othen, who was still holding her handkerchief to her mouth. It needn't take long, he said rather awkwardly, if you let me use your phone. The magistrate said he would take him to the telephone, but before going, the doctor turned toward Mrs. Othen. I regret very much indeed, but I'm afraid you'll have to get your things ready. You know how it is. Mrs. Othen seemed disconcerted. She was staring at the floor. Then I understand, she murmured, slowly nodding her head. I'll set about it at once. Before leaving, Ryu, on a sudden impulse, asked the Othens if there wasn't anything they'd like to do for them. The mother gazed at him in silence, and now the magistrate averted his eyes. No, he said, then swallowed hard. But save my son. In the early days, a mere formality, quarantine had now been reorganized by Ryu and Rambert on very strict lines. In particular, they insisted on having members of the family of a patient kept apart. If, unawares, one of them had been infected, the risks of an extension of the infection must not be multiplied. Ryu explained this to the magistrate, who signified his approval of the procedure. Nevertheless, he and his wife exchanged a glance that made it clear to Ryu how keenly they both felt the separation thus imposed on them. Mrs. Othen and her little girl could be given rooms in the quarantine hospital under Rambert's charge. For the magistrate, however, no accommodation was available except in an isolation camp the authorities were now installing in the municipal stadium, using tents supplied by the highway department. When Ryu apologized for the poor accommodation, Othen replied that there was one rule for all alike, and it was only proper to abide by it. The boy was taken to an auxiliary hospital and put in a ward of 10 beds which had formerly been a classroom. After some 20 hours, Ryu became convinced that the case was hopeless. The infection was steadily spreading, and the boy's body putting up no resistance. Tiny, half-formed, but acutely painful buboes were clogging the joints of the child's puny limbs. Obviously, it was a losing fight. Under the circumstances, Ryu had no qualms about testing Castell's serum on the boy. That night, after dinner, they performed the inoculation, a lengthy process, without getting the slightest reaction. At daybreak on the following day, they gathered round the bed to observe the effects of this test inoculation on which so much hung. The child had come out of his extreme prostration, and was tossing about convulsively on the bed. From 4 in the morning, Dr. Castell and Tarot had been keeping watch and noting, stage by stage, the progress and remissions of the malady. Tarot's bulky form was slightly drooping at the head of the bed, while at its foot, with Ryu standing behind him, Castell was seated, reading, with every appearance of calm, an old leather-bound book. One by one, as the light increased in the former classroom, the others arrived. Panelot, the first to come, leaned against the wall on the opposite side of the bed to Tarot. His face was drawn with grief, and the accumulated weariness of many weeks during which he had never spared himself had deeply seamed his somewhat prominent forehead. Grand came next. It was 7 o'clock, and he apologized for being out of breath. He could only stay a moment, but wanted to know if any definite results had been observed. Without speaking, Ryu pointed to the child. His eyes shut, his teeth clenched, his features frozen in an agonized grimace. He was rolling his head from side to side on the bolster, when there was just light enough to make out the half-obliterated figures of an equation chalked on a blackboard that still hung on the wall at the far end of the room. Rambert entered. Posting himself at the foot of the next bed, he took a package of cigarettes from his pocket, but after his first glance at the child's face, he put it back. From his chair, Castell looked at Ryu over his spectacles. "Any news of his father?" "No," said Ryu. "He's in the isolation camp." The doctor's hands were gripping the rail of the bed, his eyes fixed on the small, tortured body. Suddenly it stiffened, and seemed to give a little at the waist, as slowly the arms and legs spread out X-wise. From the body, naked under an army blanket, rose a smell of damp wool and stale sweat. The boy had gritted his teeth again. Then, very gradually, he relaxed, bringing his arms and legs back toward the center of the bed, still without speaking or opening his eyes, and his breathing seemed to quicken. Ryu looked at Taro, who hastily lowered his eyes. They had already seen children die. For many months now death had shown no favoritism, but they had never yet watched a child's agony minute by minute, as they now had been doing since daybreak. Needless to say, the pain inflicted on these innocent victims had always seemed to them to be what in fact it was, an abominable thing. But hitherto, they had felt its abomination in, so to speak, an abstract way. They had never had to witness over so long a period the death throes of an innocent child. And just then the boy gave a sudden spasm, as if something had bitten him in the stomach, and uttered a long, shrill wail. For moments that seemed endless he stayed in a queer, contorted position, his body racked by convulsive tremors. It was as if his frail frame were bending before the fierce breath of the plague, breaking under the reiterated gusts of fever. Then the storm wind passed. There came a lull, and he relaxed a little. The fever seemed to recede, leaving him gasping for breath on a dank, pestilential shore, lost in a languor that looked already like death. When, for the first time, the fiery wave broke on him, lifting him a little, the child curled himself up and shrank away to the edge of the bed, as if in terror of the flames advancing on him, licking his limbs. A moment later, after tossing his head wildly to and fro, he flung off the blanket. From between the inflamed eyelids big tears welled up and trickled down the sunken, leaded-hued cheeks. When the spasms had passed, utterly exhausted, tensing his thin legs and arms, on which, within 48 hours, the flesh had wasted to the bone, the child lay flat, raked on the tumbled bed, in a grotesque parody of crucifixion. Bending, Taro gently stroked with his big paw the small face stained with tears and sweat. Castell had closed his book a few moments before, and his eyes were now fixed on the child, but had to give a cough before continuing, because his voice rang out so harshly. "There wasn't any remission this morning, was there, Ryu?" Ryu shook his head, adding, however, that the child was putting up more resistance than one would have expected. Panelo, who was slumped against the wall, said in a low voice, "So if he is to die, he will have suffered longer." Light was increasing in the ward. The occupants of the other 9 beds were tossing about and groaning, but in tones that seemed deliberately subdued. Only one, at the far end of the ward, was screaming, or rather uttering little exclamations at regular intervals, which seemed to convey surprise more than pain. Indeed, one had the impression that, even for the sufferers, the frantic terror of the early phase had passed, and there was a sort of mournful resignation in their present attitude toward the disease. Only the child went on fighting with all his little might. Now and then Ryu took his pulse, less because this served any purpose than as an escape from his utter helplessness, and when he closed his eyes, he seemed to feel its tumult mingling with the fever of his own blood. And then, at one with the tortured child, he struggled to sustain him with all the remaining strength of his own body. But, linked for a few moments, the rhythms of their heartbeats soon fell apart, the child escaped him, and again he knew his impotence. Then he released the small, thin wrist, and moved back to his place. The light on the whitewashed walls were changing from pink to yellow. The first waves of another day of heat were beating on the windows. They hardly heard Grant saying he would come back as he turned to go. All were waiting. The child, his eyes still closed, seemed to grow a little calmer. His claw-like fingers were feebly plucking at the sides of the bed. Then they rose, scratched at the blanket over his knees, and suddenly he doubled up to his limbs, bringing his thighs above his stomach, and remained quite still. For the first time, he opened his eyes and gazed at Ryu, who was standing immediately in front of him. In the small face, rigid as a mask of grayish clay, slowly the lips parted, and from them rose a long, incessant scream, hardly varying with his respiration, and filling the ward with a fierce, indignant protest, so little childish that it seemed like a collective voice issuing from all the sufferers there. Ryu clenched his jaws. Taro looked away. Rambert went and stood beside Castell, who closed the book lying on his knees. Panlo gazed down at the small mouth, fouled with the sores of the plague and pouring out the angry death cry that had sounded through the ages of mankind. He sank on his knees, and all present found it natural to hear him say in a voice hoarse but clearly audible across the nameless, never-ending wail,
"My God, spare this child!"
But the wail continued without cease, and the other sufferers began to grow restless. The patient at the far end of the ward, whose little broken cries had gone on without a break, now quickened their tempo so that they flowed together in one unbroken cry, while the other's groans grew louder. A gust of sobs went through the room, drowning Penelow's prayer, and Ryu, who was still tightly gripping the rail of the bed, shut his eyes, dazed with exhaustion and disgust. When he opened them again, Taro was at his side. "I must go," Ryu said. "I can't bear to hear them any longer." But then, suddenly, the other sufferers fell silent, and now the doctor grew aware that the child's wail, after weakening more and more, had fluttered out into silence. Around him the groans began again, but more faintly, like a far echo of the flight that now was over. For it was over. Castell had moved around to the other side of the bed, and said the end had come. His mouth still gaping, but silent now, the child was lying among the tumbled blankets, a small, shrunken form, with the tears still wet on his cheeks. Penelo went up to the bed and made the sign of benediction. Then, gathering up his cassock, he walked out by the passage between the beds. "Will you have to start it all over again?" Taro asked Castell. The old doctor nodded slowly, with a twisted smile. "Perhaps, after all, he put up a surprisingly long resistance." Ryu was already on his way out, walking so quickly and with such a strange look on his face that Penelo put out an arm to check him when he was about to pass him in the doorway. "Come, doctor," he began. Ryu swung round on him fiercely. "Ah, that child anyhow was innocent, and you know it as well as I do." He strode on, brushing past Penelo, and walked across the school playground. Sitting on a wooden bench under the dingy, stunted trees, he wiped off the sweat that was beginning to run into his eyes. He felt like shouting imprecations, anything to loosen the stranglehold lashing his heart with steel. Heat was flooding down between the branches of the fig trees. A white haze, spreading rapidly over the blue of the morning sky, made the air yet more stifling. Ryu lay back wearily on the bench. Gazing up at the ragged branches, the shimmering sky, he slowly got back his breath and fought down his fatigue. He heard a voice behind him. "Why was there that anger in your voice just now? What we've been seeing is as unbearable to me as it was to you." Ryu turned toward Penelo. "I know I'm sorry, but weariness is a kind of madness, and there are times when the only feeling I have is one of mad revolt." "I understand," Penelo said in a low voice. "That sort of thing is revolting because it passes our human understanding. But perhaps we should love what we cannot understand." Ryu straightened up slowly. He gazed at Penelo, summoning to his gaze all the strength and fervor he could muster against his weariness. Then he shook his head. "No, father. I have a very different idea of love, and until my dying day I shall refuse to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture." A shade of disquietude crossed the priest's face. "Ah, doctor," he said sadly, "I've just realized what is meant by grace." Ryu had sunk back again on the bench. His lassitude had returned, and from its depth he spoke, more gently. "It's something I haven't got, that I know, but I'd rather not discuss that with you. We're working side by side for something that unites us, beyond blasphemy and prayers. And it's the only thing that matters." Penelo sat down beside Ryu. It was obvious that he was deeply moved. Yes, he said. "You two are working for man's salvation." Ryu tried to smile. "Salvation's much too big a word for me. I don't aim so high. I'm concerned with man's health, and for me, his health comes first." Penelo seemed to hesitate. "Doctor," he began, then fell silent. Down his face, too, sweat was trickling. Murmuring, "Goodbye for the present," he rose. His eyes were moist, When he turned to go, Ryu, who had seemed lost in thought, suddenly rose and took a step toward him. Again, please forgive me. I can promise there won't be another outburst of that kind. Panelo held out his hand, saying regretfully, "And yet, I haven't convinced you. What does it matter? What I hate is death and disease, as well as you know. And whether you wish it or not, we're allies, facing them and fighting them together." Ryu was still holding Panelo's hand. "So you see," but he refrained from meeting the priest's eyes. "God himself can't part us now." Since joining Ryu's band of workers, Panelo had spent his entire time in hospitals and places where he came in contact with plague. He had elected for the place among his fellow workers that he judged incumbent on him, in the forefront of the fight, and constantly since then he had rubbed shoulders with death. Though theoretically immunized by periodical inoculations, he was well aware that at any moment death might claim him too, and he had given thought to this. Outwardly, he had lost nothing of his serenity. But from the day on which he saw a child die, something seemed to change in him, and his face bore traces of the rising tension of his thoughts. When one day he told Ryu with a smile that he was working on a short essay entitled, "Is a Priest Justified in Consulting a Doctor?" Ryu had gathered that something graver lay behind the question than the priest's tone seemed to imply. On the doctor saying he would greatly like to have a look at the essay, Panelo informed him that he would shortly be preaching at a mass for men, and his sermon would convey some at least of his considered opinions on the question. "I hope you'll come, Doctor. This question interests you." A high wind was blowing on the day Father Panelo preached his second sermon. The congregation, it must be admitted, was sparser than on the first occasion, partly because this kind of performance had lost its novelty for our townsfolk. Indeed, considering the abnormal conditions they were up against, the very word novelty had lost all meaning. Moreover, most people, assuming they had not altogether abandoned religious observances, or did not combine them naively with a thoroughly immoral way of living, had replaced normal religious practice by, more or less, extravagant superstitions. Thus they were readier to wear polymetric medals of Saint Roch than to go to Mass. An illustration may be found in the remarkable interest shown in prophecies of all descriptions. True, in the spring, when the epidemic was expected to end abruptly at any moment. No one troubled to take another's opinion as to its probable duration, since everyone had persuaded himself that it would have none. But as the days went by, a fear grew up that the calamity might last indefinitely, and then the ending of the plague became the target of all hopes. As a result, copies of predictions attributed to soothsayers, or saints of the Catholic Church, circulated freely from hand to hand. The local printing firms were quick to realize the profit to be made by pandering to this new craze, and printed large numbers of the prophecies that had been going round in manuscript. Finding that the public appetite for this type of literature was still unsated, they had researches made in the municipal libraries for all the mental pabulum of the kind available in old chronicles, memoirs, and the like. And when this source ran dry, they commissioned journalists to write up forecasts, and, in this respect at least, the journalists proved themselves equal to their prototypes of earlier ages. Some of these prophetic writings were actually serialized in our newspapers, and read with as much avidity as the love stories that had occupied these columns in the piping times of health. Some predictions were based on far-fetched arithmetical calculations, involving the figures of the year, the total of deaths, and the number of months the plague had so far lasted. Others made comparisons with the great pestilences of former times, drew parallels, which the forecasters called constants, and claimed to deduce conclusions bearing on the present calamity. But our most popular prophets were undoubtedly those who in an apocalyptic jargon had announced sequences of events, any one of which might be constructed as applicable to the present state of affairs and was abstruse enough to admit to almost any interpretation. Thus Nostradamus and Saint Lydia were consulted daily, and always with happy results. Indeed, the one thing these prophecies had in common was that, ultimately, all were reassuring. Unfortunately, though, the plague was not. Thus, superstition had usurped the place of religion in the life of our town, and that is why the church in which Panelo preached his sermon was only 3/4 full. That evening, When Ryu arrived, the wind was pouring in great gusts through the swing doors and filling the aisles with sudden drafts. And it was in a cold, silent church, surrounded by a congregation of men exclusively, that Ryu watched the father climb into the pulpit. He spoke in a gender, more thoughtful tone than on the previous occasion, and several times was noted to be stumbling over his words. A yet more noteworthy change was that instead of saying you, he now said we. However, his voice grew gradually firmer as he proceeded. He started by recalling that for many a month long, plague had been in our midst, and we now knew it better, after having seen it often seated at our tables or at the bedsides of those we loved. We had seen it walking at our side, or waiting for our coming at the places where we worked. Thus we were now, perhaps, better able to comprehend what it was telling us unceasingly, a message to which, in the first shock of the visitation, we might not have listened with due heed. What he, Father Panelot, had said in his first sermon still held good. Such, anyhow, was his belief. And yet, perhaps, as we may befall any one of us, here he struck his breast, his words and thoughts had lacked in charity. However this might be, one thing was not to be gainsaid, a fact that always, under all circumstances, we should bear in mind. Appearances notwithstanding, all trials, however cruel, worked together for good to the Christian. And indeed, what a Christian should always seek in his hour of trial was to discern that good, and what it consisted and how best he could turn it into account. At this stage, the people near Ryu seemed to settle in against the armrests of their pews and make themselves as comfortable as they could. One of the big padded entrance doors was softly thudding in the wind, and someone got up to secure it. As a result, Ryu's attention wandered, and he did not follow well what Panelot now went on to say. Apparently, it came to this. We might try to explain the phenomenon of the plague, but above all, should learn what it had to teach us. Ryu gathered that, to the father's thinking, there was really nothing to explain. His interest quickened when, in a more emphatic tone, the preacher said that there were some things we could grasp as touching God, and others we could not. There was no doubt as to the existence of good and evil, and as a rule, it was easy to see the difference between them. The difficulty began when we looked into the nature of evil, and among things evil he included human suffering. Thus we had apparently needful pain, and apparently needless pain. We had Don Juan cast into hell, and a child's death. For while it is right that a libertine should be struck down, we see no reason for a child's suffering. And truth to tell, nothing was more important on earth than a child's suffering, the horror it inspires in us, and the reasons we must find to account for it. In other manifestations of life, God made things easy for us, and thus far, our religion had no merit. But in this respect, he put us, so to speak, with our backs against the wall. Indeed, we were all up against the wall the plague had built around us, and in its lethal shadow we must work out our salvation. He, Father Panelot, refused to have recourse to simple devices enabling him to scale that wall. Thus he might easily have assured them that the child's sufferings would be compensated for by an eternity of bliss awaiting him. But how could he give that assurance when, to tell the truth, he knew nothing about it? For who would dare to assert that eternal happiness can compensate for a single moment's human suffering? He who asserted that would not be a true Christian, a follower of the Master, who knew all the pangs of suffering in his body and his soul. No, he, Father Panelot, would keep faith with that great symbol of all suffering, the tortured body on the cross. He would stand fast, his back to the wall, and faced honestly the terrible problem of a child's agony. And he would boldly say to those who listened to his words today, "My brothers, a time of testing has come for us all. We must believe everything or deny everything. And who among you, I ask, would dare to deny everything?" It crossed Ryu's mind that Father Panelot was dallying with heresy in speaking thus, but he had no time to follow up the thought. The preacher was declaring vehemently that this uncompromising duty laid on the Christian was at once his ruling virtue and his privilege. He was well aware that certain minds, schooled to a more indulgent and conventional morality, might well be dismayed, not to say outraged, by the seemingly excessive standard of Christian virtue about which he was going to speak. But religion in a time of plague could not be the religion of every day. While God might accept and even desire that the soul should take its ease and rejoice in happier times, in periods of extreme calamity, he laid extreme demands on it. Thus today, God had vouchsafed to his creatures an ordeal such that they might acquire and practice the greatest of all virtues, that of the all and nothing. Many centuries previously, a profane writer had claimed to reveal a secret of the Church by declaring that purgatory did not exist. He wished to convey that there could be no half measures. There was only the alternative between heaven and hell. You were either saved or damned. That, according to Penelot, was a heresy that could spring only from a blind, disordered soul. Nevertheless, there may have well been periods of history when purgatory could not be hoped for. Periods when it was impossible to speak of venial sin. Every sin was deadly, and every indifference criminal. It was all, or it was nothing. The preacher paused, and Ryu heard more clearly the whistling of the wind outside. Judging by the sounds that came in below the closed doors, it had risen to storm pitch. Then he heard Father Penelot's voice again. He was saying that the total acceptance of which he was been speaking was not to be taken in the limited sense usually given to the words. He was not thinking of mere resignation, or even of that harder virtue, humility. It involved humiliation, but a humiliation to which the person humiliated gave full assent. True, the agony of a child was humiliating to the heart and to the mind, but that was why we had to come to terms with it. And that, too, was why. And here Penelot assured those present that it was not easy to say what he was about to say. Since it was God's will, we, too, should will it. Thus, and thus only, the Christian should face the problem squarely, and, scorning subterfuge, pierce to the heart of the supreme issue, the essential choice. And his choice would be to believe everything, so as not to be forced into denying everything. Like those worthy women who, after learning that buboes were the natural issues through which the body cast out infection, went to their church and prayed, "Please God give him buboes." Thus the Christian should yield himself wholly to the divine will, even though it passed his understanding. It was wrong to say, "This I understand, but this I cannot accept." We must go straight into the heart of that which is unacceptable, precisely because it is thus that we are constrained to make our choice. The sufferings of children were our bread of affliction, but without this bread, our souls would die of spiritual hunger. The shuffling sounds which usually followed the moment when the speaker paused were beginning to make themselves heard when, unexpectedly, he raised his voice, making as if to put himself in the hearer's place, and asked what then was the proper course to follow. He made no doubt that the ugly word fatalism would be applied to what he said. Well, he would not boggle at the word, provided he were allowed to qualify it with the adjective active. Needless to say, there was no question of imitating the Abyssinian Christians of whom he had spoken previously. Nor should one think of acting like those Persians who, in time of plague, threw their infected garments on those Christian sanitary workers, and loudly called on heaven to give plague to those infidels who were trying to avert a pestilence sent by God. But, on the other hand, it would be no less wrong to imitate the monks at Cairo, who, when plague was raging in the town, distributed the host with pincers at the Mass, so as to avoid contact with wet, warm mouths in which infection might be latent. The plague-stricken Persians and the monks were equally at fault. For the former, a child's agony did not count. With the latter, on the contrary, the natural dread of suffering ranked highest in their conduct. In both cases, the real problem had been shirked. They had closed their ears to God's voice. But, Penelot continued, there were other precedents of which he would now remind them. If the chronicles of the Black Death at Marseille were to be trusted, only 4 of the 81 monks in the Mercy Monastery survived the epidemic. And of these 4, 3 took to flight. Thus far the chronicler, and it was not his task to tell us more than the bare facts. But when he read that chronicle, Father Penelot had found his thoughts fixed on the monk who stayed on by himself, despite the death of his 77 companions, and above all, despite the example of his 3 brothers who had fled. And, bringing down his fist on the edge of the pulpit, Father Penelot cried in a ringing voice, "My brothers, each one of us must be the one who stays. There was no question of not taking precautions, or failing to comply with the orders wisely promulgated for the weekly wheel in the disorders of the pestilence. nor shall listen to certain moralists who told us to sink on our knees and give up the struggle. No, we should go forward, groping our way through the darkness, stumbling perhaps at times, and try to do what good lay in our power. As for the rest, we must hold fast, trusting in the divine goodness, even as to the deaths of little children, and not seeking personal respite. At this point, Father Panelot evoked the august figure of Bishop Belzunce during the Marseille plague. He reminded his hearers how, toward the close of the epidemic, the bishop, having done all that it behooved him, shut himself up in his palace, behind high walls, after laying in a stock of food and drink. With a sudden revulsion of feeling, such as often comes in times of extreme tribulation, the inhabitants of Marseille, who had idolized him hitherto, now turned against him, piling up corpses round his house in order to infect it, and even flung bodies over the walls to make sure of his death. Thus, in a moment of weakness, the bishop had proposed to isolate himself from the outside world, and, lo and behold, corpses rained down on his head. This had a lesson for us all. We must convince ourselves that there is no island of escape in times of plague. No, there was no middle course. We must accept the dilemma, and either choose to hate God or to love God. And who would dare to choose to hate him? My brothers. The preacher's tone showed he was nearing the conclusion of his sermon. The love of God is a hard love. It demands total self-surrender, disdain of our human personality. And yet, it alone can reconcile us to suffering and the deaths of children. It alone can justify them, since we cannot understand them, and we can only make God's will ours. That is the hard lesson I will share with you today. That is the faith, cruel in men's eyes and crucial in God's, which we must ever strive to compass. We must aspire beyond ourselves toward that high and fearful vision. And on that lofty plane all will fall into place, all discords be resolved, and truth flash forth from the dark cloud of seeming injustice. Thus, in some churches of the south of France, plague victims have lain sleeping many a century under the flagstones of the chancel, and priests now speak above their tombs, and the divine message they bring to men rises from that charnel, to which, nevertheless, children have contributed their share. When Ryu was preparing to leave the church, a violent gust swept up the nave through the half-open doors, and buffeted the faces of the departing congregation. It brought with it a smell of rain, a tang of drenched sidewalks, warning them of the weather they would encounter outside. An old priest and a young deacon who were walking immediately in front of Ryu had much difficulty in keeping their headdresses from blowing away. But this did not prevent the elder of the two from discussing the sermon they had heard. He paid tribute to the preacher's eloquence, but the boldness of thought Panelot had shown gave him pause. In his opinion, the sermon had displayed more uneasiness than real power, and at Panelot's age, a priest has no business to feel uneasy. The young deacon, his head bowed to protect his face from the wind, replied that he saw much of the father, had followed the evolution of his ideas, and believed his forthcoming pamphlet would be bolder still. Indeed, it might well be refused the imprimatur. "You don't say so. What's the main idea?" asked the old priest. They were now in the cathedral square, and for some moments the roar of the wind made it impossible for the younger man to speak. When there was a slight lull, he said briefly to his companion, "That it's illogical for a priest to call in a doctor." Tarot, when told by Ryu what Panelot had said, remarked that he'd known a priest who had lost his faith during the war, as the result of seeing a young man's face with both eyes destroyed. "Panelot is right," Tarot continued. "When an innocent youth can have his eyes destroyed, a Christian should either lose his faith or consent to having his eyes destroyed. Panelot declines to lose his faith, and he will go through with it to the end. That's what he meant to say." It may be that this remark of Tarot's throws some light on the regrettable events which followed, in the course of which the priest's conduct seemed inexplicable to his friends. The listener will judge for himself. A few days after the sermon, Panelot had to move out of his rooms. It was a time when many people were obliged to change their residence owing to the new conditions created by the plague. Thus Tarot, when his hotel was requisitioned, had to go to live with Ryu, and now the father had to vacate the lodgings provided for him by his order, and stay in the house of a pious old lady who had so far escaped the epidemic. During the process of moving, Panelot had been feeling more run down than ever, mentally as well as physically. and it was this that put him in the bad books of his hostess. One evening, when she was enthusiastically vaunting the merits of St. Odelia's prophecies, the priest betrayed a slight impatience, probably due to fatigue. All his subsequent efforts to bring the good lady round to, anyhow, a state of benevolent neutrality came to nothing. He had made a bad impression, and it went on rankling. So each night on his way to his bedroom, where almost all the furniture was dotted with crochet covers, he had to contemplate the back of his hostess seated in her drawing room, and carry away with him a memory of the sour "Good night, father," she flung at him over her shoulder. It was on one such evening that he felt, like a flood bursting the dikes, the turbulent onrush in his wrists and temples of the fever latent in his blood for several days past. The only available account of what followed comes from the lips of the old lady. Next morning, she rose early, as was her wont. After an hour or so, puzzled at not seeing the father leave his room, she brought herself, not without some hesitation, to knock at his door. She found him still in bed after a sleepless night. He had difficulty in breathing, and looked more flushed than usual. She had suggested most politely, as she put it, that a doctor should be called in, but her suggestion had been brushed aside with a curtness that she described as quite unmannerly, so she had no alternative but to leave the room. Later in the morning, the father rang and asked if he could see her. He apologized for his lack of courtesy, and assured her that what he was suffering from could not be plague, as he had none of the symptoms. It was no more than a passing indisposition. The lady replied with dignity that her suggestion had not been prompted by any apprehension of that sort. She took no thought for her personal security, which was in God's hands, but that she felt a certain measure of responsibility for the father's welfare while he was under her roof. When he said nothing, his hostess, wishing, according to her account, to do her duty by him, offered to send for her doctor. Father Panelo told her not to trouble, adding some explanations that seemed to the old lady incoherent, not to say nonsensical. The only thing she gathered, and it was precisely this that appeared to her so incomprehensible, was that the father refused to hear of a doctor's visit because it was against his principles. Her impression was that her guest's mind had been unhinged by fever, and she confined herself to bringing him a cup of tea. Resolutely mindful of the obligations imposed on her by the situation, she visited the invalid regularly every 2 hours. What struck her most about him was his restlessness, which continued throughout the day. He would throw off the blankets, then pull them back, and he kept running his hand over his forehead, which was glistening with sweat. Every now and then he sat up in bed, and tried to clear his throat with a thick, grating cough, which almost sounded like retching. At these moments, he seemed to be vainly struggling to force up from his lungs a clot of some semi-solid substance that was choking him. After each unavailing effort, he sank back, utterly exhausted, on the pillow. Then he would raise himself again a little, and stare straight in front of him with a fixity even more dismaying than the paroxysms which had preceded it. Even now the old lady was reluctant to annoy her guest by calling in the doctor. After all, it might be no more than an attack of fever, spectacular as were its manifestations. However, in the afternoon, she made another attempt to talk to the priest, but she could get out of him no more than a few rambling phrases. She renewed her proposal to call in the doctor. Orat Panelo sat up, and in a stifled voice, emphatically declined to see a doctor. Under these circumstances, it seemed best to the old lady to wait till the following morning. If the father's condition showed no more improvement, she would ring up the number announced 10 times daily on the radio by the Ranstock Information Bureau. Still conscious of her obligations, she resolved to visit the invalid from time to time in the course of the night, and give him any attention he might need. But after bringing him a decoration of herbal tea, she decided to lay down for a while. Only at daybreak did she wake up, and then she hurried to the priest's room. Father Panelo was lying quite still. His face had lost its deep flush of the previous day, and now had a deathly pallor, all the more impressive because the cheeks had kept their fullness. He was gazing up at the bead fringe of a lamp hanging above the bed. When the old lady came in, he turned his head to her. As she quaintly put it, he looked as if he'd been severely thrashed all the night long, and more dead than alive. She was greatly struck by the apathy of his voice when, on her asking how he was feeling, he replied that he was in a bad way. He did not need a doctor, and all he wished was to be taken to the hospital so as to comply with the regulations. Panic-stricken, she hurried to the telephone. Ryu came at noon. After hearing what the old lady had to say, He replied briefly that Penelo was right, but it was probably too late. The father welcomed him with the same air of complete indifference. Ryu examined him, and was surprised to find none of the characteristic symptoms of bubonic or pneumonic plague, except congestion and obstruction of the lungs. But his pulse was so weak and his general state so alarming that there was little hope of saving him. "You have none of the specific symptoms of the disease," Ryu told him, "but I admit one can't be sure, and I must isolate you." The father smiled queerly, as if for politeness' sake, but said nothing. Ryu left the room to telephone, then came back and looked at the priest. "I'll stay with you," he said gently. Penelo showed a little more animation, and a sort of warmth came back to his eyes when he looked up at the doctor. Then, speaking with such difficulty that it was impossible to tell if there was sadness in his voice, he said, "Thanks, but priests can have no friends. They have given their all to God." He asked for the crucifix that hung above the head of the bed. When given it, he turned away to gaze at it. At the hospital, Penelo did not utter a word. He submitted passively to the treatment given him, but never let go of the crucifix. However, his case continued doubtful, and Ryu could not feel sure how to diagnose it. For several weeks indeed, the disease had seemed to make a point of confounding diagnoses. In the case of Penelo, what followed was to show that this uncertainty had no consequence. His temperature rose. Throughout the day the cough grew louder, raking the enfeebled body. At last, at nightfall, Father Penelo brought up the clot of matter that was choking him. It was red. Even at the height of his fever, Penelo's eyes kept their black serenity, and when, next morning, he was found dead, his body drooping over the bedside, they betrayed nothing. Against his name the index card recorded, "Doubtful case." All Souls' Day that year was very different from what it had been in former years. True, the weather was seasonable. There had been a sudden change, and the great heat had given place to mild autumnal air. As in other years, a cool wind blew all day, and big clouds raced from one horizon to the other, trailing shadows over the houses upon which fell again, when they had passed the pale gold light of a November sky. The first waterproofs made their appearance. Indeed, one was struck by the number of glossy, rubberized garments to be seen. The reason was that our newspapers had informed us that 200 years previously, during the great pestilences of southern Europe, the doctors wore oiled clothing as a safeguard against infection. The shops had seized this opportunity of unloading their stock of out-of-fashion waterproofs. But these familiar aspects of All Souls' Day could not make us forget that the cemeteries were left unvisited. In previous years, the rather sickly smell of chrysanthemums had filled the streetcars, while long lines of women could be seen making pilgrimage to the places where members of the family were buried, to lay flowers on the graves. This was the day when they made amends for the oblivion and dereliction in which their dead had slept for many a month. But in the plague year, people no longer wished to be reminded of their dead, because, indeed, they were thinking all too much about them as it was. There was no more question of revisiting them with a shade of regret and much melancholy. They were no longer the forsaken to whom, one day in the year, you came to justify yourself. They were intruders whom you would rather forget. This is why the Day of the Dead this year was tactfully but willfully ignored. As Courtauld dryly remarked, Thoreau noted that the habit of irony was growing on him more and more. Each day was for us a Day of the Dead. And in fact, the balor fires of the pestilence were blazing ever more merrily in the crematorium. It is true that the actual number of deaths showed no increase, but it seemed that plague had settled in for good at its most virulent, and it took its daily toll of deaths with the punctual zeal of a good civil servant. Theoretically, and in the view of the authorities, this was a hopeful sign. The fact that the graph after its long rising curve had flattened out seemed to many, Dr. Richard for example, reassuring. "The graph's good today," he would remark, rubbing his hands. To his mind, the disease had reached what he called high water mark. Thereafter, it could but ebb. He gave the credit of this to Dr. Castell's new serum, which, indeed, had brought off some quite unlooked-for recoveries. While not dissenting, the old doctor reminded him that the future remained uncertain. History proved that epidemics have a way of recrudescing when least expected. The authorities, who had long been desirous of giving a fillip to the morale of the populace, but had so far been prevented by the plague from doing so, now proposed to convene a meeting of the medical corps, and ask for an announcement on the subject. Unfortunately, just before the meeting was due to take place, Dr. Richard II was carried off by the plague, then precisely at high water mark. The effect of this regrettable event, which, sensational as it was, actually proved nothing, was to make our authorities swing back to pessimism as inconsequently as they had previously indulged in optimism. As for Castell, he confined himself to preparing his serums with a maximum of care. By this time, no public place nor building had escaped conversion into a hospital or quarantine camp, with the exception of the prefect's offices, which were needed for administrative purposes and committee meetings. In a general way, however, owing to the relative stability of the epidemic at this time, Ryu's organizations were still able to cope with the situation. Though working constantly at high pressure, the doctors and their helpers were not forced to contemplate still greater efforts. All they had to do was to carry on automatically, so to speak, their all but superhuman task. The pneumonic type of infection, cases of which had already been detected, were now spreading all over the town. One can almost believe that the high winds were kindling and fanning its flames in people's chests. The victims of pneumonic plague succumbed much more quickly, after coughing up plague-stained sputum. This new form of the epidemic looked like being more contagious as well as even more fatal. However, the opinions of experts had always been divided on this matter. For greater safety, all sanitary workers wore masks of sterilized muslin. On the face of it, the disease should have extended its ravages. But, the cases of bubonic plague showing a decrease, the death rate remained constant. Meanwhile, the authorities had another cause for anxiety in the difficulty of maintaining the food supply. Profiteers were taking a hand and purveying at enormous prices essential foodstuffs not available in the shops. The result was that poor families were in great straits, while the rich went short of practically nothing. Thus, whereas plague by its impartial ministrations should have promoted equality among our townsfolk, it now had the opposite effect, and, thanks to the habitual conflict of cupidities, exacerbated the sense of injustice rankling in men's hearts. They were assured, of course, of the inevitable equality of death, but nobody wanted that kind of equality. Poor people who were feeling the pinch thought still more nostalgically of towns and villages in the nearby countryside, where bread was cheap and life without restrictions. Indeed, they had a natural, if illogical feeling that they should have been permitted to move out to these happier places. The feeling was embodied in a slogan shouted in the streets and chalked up on walls: "Bread or fresh air." This half-ironical battle cry was a signal for some demonstrations that, though easily repressed, made everyone aware that an ugly mood was developing among us. The newspapers, needless to say, complied with the instructions given them: optimism at all costs. If one was to believe what one read on them, our populace was giving a fine example of courage and composure. But in a town thrown back upon itself, in which nothing could be kept secret, no one had illusions about the example given by the public. To form a correct idea about the courage and composure talked about by our journalists, you only had to visit one of the quarantine depots or isolation camps established by our authorities. As it so happens, the narrator, being fully occupied elsewhere, had no occasion to visit any of them, and must fall back on Thoreau's diary for a description of the conditions in these places. Thoreau gives an account of a visit he made, accompanied by Rambert, to a camp located in the municipal stadium. The stadium lies on the outskirts of the town, between a street along which runs a car line and a stretch of wasteland extending to the extreme edge of the plateau on which Oran is built. It was already surrounded by high concrete walls, and all that was needed to make escape practically impossible was to post sentries at the 4 entrance gates. The walls served another purpose. They screened the unfortunates in quarantine from the view of people on the road. Against this advantage may be set the fact that the inmates could hear all day, though they could not see them, the passing streetcars, and recognize by the increased volume of sound coming from the road the hours when people had knocked off work or were going to it. And this brought home to them that the life from which they were debarring was going on as before, within a few yards of them, and that those high walls parted 2 worlds as alien to each other as 2 different planets. Thoreau and Rambert chose a Sunday afternoon for their visit to the stadium. They were accompanied by Gonzalez, the football player, with whom Rambert had kept in contact, and who had let himself be persuaded into undertaking, in rotation with others, the surveillance of the camp. This visit was to enable Rambert to introduce Gonzalez to the camp commandant. When they met that afternoon, Gonzalez's first remark was that this was exactly the time when, before the plague, he used to start getting into his football togs. Now that the sport fields had been requisitioned, all that was of the past, and Gonzalez was feeling, and showed it, at a loose end. This was one of the reasons why he had accepted the post proposed by Rambert, but he made it a condition that he was to be on duty during weekends only. The sky was overcast, and, glancing up at it, Gonzalez observed regretfully that a day like this, neither too hot nor rainy, would have been perfect for a game. And then he fell to conjuring up, as best he could, the once familiar smell of embrocation in the dressing rooms, the stands crowded with people, the colored shirts of the players, showing up brightly against the tawny soil, the lemons at intermissions, all bottled lemonade that tilted parched throats with 1,000 refreshing pinpricks. Tarot also records how, on the way, as they walked the shabby outer streets, the footballer gave kicks to all the small loose stones. His object was to shoot them into the sewer gates of the gutters. And whenever he did this, he would shout, "Goal!" When he had finished his cigarette, he spat the stub in front of him, and tried to catch it on his toe before it touched the ground. Some children were playing near the stadium, and when one of them sent a ball toward the 3 men, Gonzalez went out of his way to return it neatly. On entering the stadium, they found the stands full of people. The field was dotted with several hundred red tents, inside which one had glimpses of bedding and bundles of clothes or rugs. The stands had been kept open for the use of the internees in hot or rainy weather. But it was a rule of the camp that everyone must be in his tent at sunset. Shower baths had been installed under the stands, and what used to be the players' dressing rooms converted into hospitals and infirmaries. The majority of the inmates of the camp were sitting about on the stands. Some, however, were strolling on the touchlines, and a few, squatting at the entrance of their tents, were listlessly contemplating the scene around them. In the stands, many of those slumped on the wooden tiers had a look of vague expectancy. "What do they do with themselves all day?" Tarot asked Rambert. "Nothing." Almost all, indeed, had empty hands and idly dangling arms. Another curious thing about this multitude of derelicts was its silence. "When they first came, there was such a din you couldn't hear yourself speak," Rambert said. "But as the days went by, they grew quieter and quieter." In his notes, Tarot gives what, to his mind, would explain this change. He pictures them in the early days bundled together in the tents, listening to the buzz of flies, scratching themselves, and, whenever they found an obliging listener, shrilly voicing their fear or indignation. But when the camp grew overcrowded, fewer and fewer people were inclined to play the part of sympathetic listener. So they had no choice but to hold their peace and nurse their mistrust of everyone and everything. One had, indeed, a feeling that suspicion was falling, dew-like, from the greyly shining sky over the brick-red camp. Yes, there was suspicion in the eyes of all. Obviously, they were thinking there must be some good reason for the isolation inflicted on them, and they had the air of people who were puzzling over their problem and were afraid. Everyone Tarot set eyes on had that vacant gaze and was visibly suffering from the complete break with all that life had meant to them. And since they could not be thinking of their death all the time, they thought of nothing. They were on vacation. But worst of all, Tarot writes, is that they're forgotten, and they know it. Their friends have forgotten them because they have other things to think about, naturally enough. And those they love have forgotten them because all their energies are devoted to making schemes and taking steps to get them out of the camp. And by dint of always thinking about these schemes and steps, they have ceased thinking about those who release they're trying to secure. And that, too, is natural enough. In fact, it comes to this. Nobody's capable of really thinking about anyone, even in the worst calamity. For really, to think about someone means thinking about that person every minute of the day, without letting one's thoughts be diverted by anything, by meals, by a fly that settles on one's cheek, by household duties, or by a sudden itch somewhere. But there are always flies and itches. That's why life is difficult to live, and these people know it only too well. The camp manager came up. A gentleman named Othen, he said, would like to see them. Leaving Gonzalez in the office, he led the others to a corner of the grand stand, where they saw M. Othen sitting by himself. He rose as they approached. The magistrate was dressed exactly as in the past and still wore a stiff collar. The only changes Tarot noted were that the tufts of hair over his temples were not brushed back, and that one of his shoelaces was undone. Othen appeared very tired, and not once did he look the visitors in the face. He said he was glad to see them, and requested them to thank Dr. Ryu for all he had done. Some moments of silence ensued, then with an effort, the magistrate spoke again. I hope Jacques didn't suffer too much. This was the first time Thoreau heard him utter his son's name, and he realized that something had changed. The sun was setting, and, flooding through a rift in the clouds, the level rays raked the stands, tinging their faces with a yellow glow. No, Thoreau said. No, I couldn't really say he suffered. When they took their leave, the magistrate was still gazing toward the light. They called in at the office to say goodbye to Gonzales, whom they found studying the duty roster. The footballer was laughing when he shook hands with them. Anyhow, I'm back in the good old dressing room, he chuckled. That's something to go on with. Soon after, when the camp manager was seeing Thoreau and Rambert out, they heard a crackling noise coming from the stands. A moment later, the loudspeakers, which in happier times served to announce the results of games or to introduce the teams, informed the inmates of the camp that they were going to go back to their tents for the evening meal. Slowly, everyone filed off the stands and shuffled toward the tents. After all were under canvas, 2 small electric trucks, of the kind used for transporting baggage on railroad platforms, began to wend their way between the tents. While the occupants held forth their arms, 2 ladles plunged into the 2 big cauldrons on each truck and neatly tipped their contents into the waiting mess kits. Then the truck moved on to the next tent. Very efficient, Thoreau remarked. The camp manager beamed as he shook hands. Yes, isn't it? We're great believers in efficiency in this camp. Dusk was falling. The sky had cleared, and the camp was bathed in a cool, soft light. Through the hush of evening came a faint trickle of spoons and plates. Above the tents, bats were circling, vanishing abruptly into the darkness. A streetcar squealed on a switch outside the walls. Poor Monsieur Othen, Thoreau murmured as the gate closed behind him. One would like to do something to help him, but how can you help it, Judge? There were other camps of much the same kind in the town, but the narrator, for lack of first-hand information and in deference to veracity, has nothing to add about them. This much, however, he can say. The mere existence of these camps, the smell of crowded humanity coming from them, the baying of their loudspeakers in the dusk, the air of mystery that clung about them, and the dread these forbidden places inspired, told seriously on our fellow citizens' morale and added to the general nervousness and apprehension. Breaches of the peace and minor riots became more frequent. As November drew to a close, the mornings turned much colder. Heavy downpours had scoured the streets and washed the sky clean of clouds. In the mornings, a weak sunlight bathed the town in a cold, sparkling sheen. The air warmed up, however, as night approached. It was such a night that Thoreau chose for telling something of himself to Dr. Ryu. After a particularly tiring day, about 10 o'clock, Thoreau proposed to the doctor that they should go together for an evening visit to Ryu's old asthma patient. There was a soft glow above the housetops in the old town, and a light breeze fanned their faces at the street crossings. Coming from the silent streets, they found the old man's loquacity rather irksome at first. He launched into a long harangue to the effects that some folks were getting fed up, that it was always the same people who had all the jam, and things couldn't go on like that indefinitely. One day that'd be, he rubbed his hands, a fine old row. He continued expatiating on this theme all the time the doctor was attending to him. They heard footsteps overhead. Noticing Thoreau's upward glance, the old woman explained that it was the girls from next door walking on the terrace. She added that one had a lovely view up there, and that as the terraces in this part of the town often joined up with the next one on one side, the woman could visit their neighbors without having to go into the street. Why not go up and have a look? The old man suggested. You'll get a breath of nice fresh air. They found nobody on the terrace, only 3 empty chairs. On one side, as far as eye could reach, was a row of terraces, the most remote of which attributed on a dark, rugged mass that they recognized as the hill nearest the town. On the other side, spanning some streets and the unseen harbor, their gaze came to rest on the horizon, where sea and sky merged in a dim, vibrant grayness. Beyond a black patch that they knew to be the cliffs, a sudden glow, whose source they could not see, sprang up at regular intervals. The lighthouse at the entrance of the fairway was still functioning for the benefit of ships that passed Oran's unusual harbor, went on to other ports along the coast. In a sky swept crystal clear by the night wind, the stars showed like silver flakes, tarnished now and then by the yellow gleam of the revolving light. Perfumes of spice and warm stone were wafted on the breeze. Everything was very still. "A pleasant spot," said Ryu, as he lowered himself into a chair. "You'd think that plague had never found its way up here." Taro was gazing seawards, his back to the doctor. "Yes," he replied after a moment's silence. "It's good to be here." Then, settling into the chair beside Ryu, he fixed his eyes on his face. 3 times the glow spread up the sky and died away. A faint clatter of crockery rose from a room opening on the street below. A door banged somewhere in the house. "Ryu," Taro said in a quite ordinary tone, "do you realize that you've never tried to find out anything about me, the man I am? Can I regard you as a friend?" "Yes, of course. We're friends, only as far as we haven't had much time to show it." "Good. That gives me confidence. Suppose we now take an hour off for friendship." Ryu smiled by way of answer. "Well, here goes." There was a long faint hiss some streets off, the sound of a car speeding on the wet pavement. It died away, then some vague shout a long way off broke the stillness again. Then, like a dense veil slowly falling from the starry sky on the 2 men, silence returned. Taro had moved, and now was sitting on the parapet, facing Ryu, who was slumped back in his chair. All that could be seen of him was a dark, bulky form outlined against the glimmering sky. He had much to tell. What follows gives it more or less in his own words. "To make things simpler, Ryu, let me begin by saying I had plague already, long before I came to this town and encountered it here, which is tantamount to saying I'm like everybody else. Only there are some people who don't know it, or feel at ease in that condition. Others know and want to get out of it. Personally, I've always wanted to get out of it. When I was young, I lived with the idea of my innocence, that is to say, with no idea at all. I'm not the self-tormenting kind of person, and I make a suitable start in life. I brought off everything I set my hand to. I moved at ease in the field of the intellect. I got on excellently with women, and if I had occasional qualms, they passed as lightly as they came. Then one day, I started thinking, and now, I should tell you I wasn't poor in my young days, as you were. My father had an important post, he was prospecting attorney. But look at him, you'd never have guessed it. He appeared, and was, a kindly, good-natured man. My mother was a simple, rather shy woman, and I've always loved her greatly, but I'd rather not talk about her. My father was always very kind to me, and I even think he tried to understand me. He wasn't a model husband, I know that now, but I can't say it shocks me particularly. Even in his infidelities, he behaved as one could count on his behaving, and never gave rise to such a scandal. In short, he wasn't at all original, now he's dead. I realize that, while no plaster saint, he was a very decent man, as men go. He kept the middle way, that's all. He was the type of man for whom one had an affection of the mild but steady order, which is the kind that wears best. My father had one peculiarity. The big railway directory was his bedside book. Not that he often took a train, almost his only journeys were to Brittany, where he had a small country house to which we went every summer. But he was a walking timetable. He could tell you the exact times of departure and arrival of the Paris-Berlin expresses, how to get from Meissen to Warsaw, which trains to take and at what hours, the precise distance between any 2 capitals you might mention. Could you tell me offhand how to get from Briticon to Chamonix? Even a station master would scratch his head, I should say. Well, my father had the answer pat. Almost every evening he enlarged his knowledge of the subject, and he prided himself on it. This hobby of his much amused me. I would put complicated travel problems to him and check his answers afterwards by the railroad directory. They were invariably correct. My father and I got on together excellently, thanks largely to these railway games we played in the evenings. I was exactly the audience he needed, attentive and appreciative. Personally, I regarded this accomplishment of his quite as remarkable in its ways as most accomplishments. But I'm letting my tongue run away with me, and attributing too much importance to that worthy man. Actually, he played only an indirect role in the great change of heart about which I want to tell you. The most he did to me was to touch off a train of thoughts. When I was 17, my father asked me to come to hear him speak in court. There was a big case on at the SI's, and probably he thought I'd see him to his best advantage. Also, I suspect he'd hope I'd be duly impressed by the pomp and ceremony of the law, and encouraged to take up his profession. I could tell he was keen on my going, and the prospect of seeing a side of my father's character so different from that we saw at home appealed to me. Those were absolutely the only reasons I had for going to the trial. What happened in a court had always seemed to me as natural, as much in the order of things, as a military parade on the 14th of July, or a school speech day. My notions on the subject are purely abstract, and I never given it a serious thought. The only picture I carried away with me of that day's proceedings was a picture of the criminal. I have little doubt he was guilty of what crime is no great matter. That little man of about 30, with sparse, sandy hair, seemed so eager to confess everything, so genuinely horrified at what he'd done and what was going to be done with him, that after a few minutes I had eyes for nothing and nobody else. He looked like a yellow owl scared blind by too much light. His tie was slightly awry. He kept biting his nails, those of one hand only, his right. I needn't go on, need I? You've understood he was a living human being. As for me, it came on me suddenly, in a flash of understanding. Until then I thought of him only under his commonplace official designation, as the defendant. And though I can't say I quite forgot my father, something seemed to grip my vitals at that moment, and riveted all my attention on the little man in the dock. I hardly heard what was being said. I only knew they were set on killing that living man, and an uprush of some elemental instinct, like a wave, had swept me to his side. And I did not really wake up until my father rose to address the court. In his red gown he was another man, no longer genial or good-natured. His mouth spewed out long, turgid phrases like an endless stream of snakes. I realized he was clamoring for the prisoner's death, telling the jury that they owed it to society to find him guilty. He went so far as to demand that the man should have his head cut off. Not exactly in those words, I admit. He must pay the supreme penalty, was the formula. But the difference, really, was slight, and the result was same. He had the head he asked for. Only, of course, it wasn't he who did the actual job. I, who saw the whole business through to its conclusion, felt a far closer, far more terrifying intimacy with that wretched man than my father could ever have felt. Nevertheless, it fell to him, in the course of his duties, to be present at what's politely termed the prisoner's last moments. But what better could be called murder in its most despicable form? From that day on, I couldn't even see the railroad directory without a shudder of disgust. I took a horrified interest in legal proceedings, death sentences, executions, and I realized with dismay that my father must have often witnessed those brutal murders. On those days when, as I noticed without guessing what it meant, he rose very early in the morning. I remembered he used to wind his alarm clock on those occasions, to make sure. I didn't dare to broach the subject with my mother, but I watched her now more closely and saw that their life in common had ceased to mean anything. She had abandoned hope. That helped me to forgive her, as I put it to myself all the time. Later on, I learned that there had been nothing to forgive. She'd been quite poor until her marriage, and poverty had taught her resignation. Probably you're expecting me to tell you that I left home at once. No, I stayed for many months, nearly, a year in fact. Then one evening, my father asked for the alarm clock as he had to get up early. I couldn't sleep that night. Next day, when he came home, I'd gone. To cut a long story short, I had a letter from my father, who had set inquiries on foot to find me. I went to see him, and without explaining my reasons, told him quite calmly that I'd kill myself if he forced me to return. He wound up by letting me have my way. He was, as I've said, a kindly man at bottom, gave me a lecture on the silliness of wanting to live my life. That was how he accounted for my conduct, and I didn't undeceive him, and plenty of good advice. I could see he really felt it deeply, and it was an effort for him to keep back his tears. Subsequently, but quite a long time after that, I formed a habit of visiting my mother periodically, and I always saw him on those occasions. I imagine these infrequent meetings satisfied my father. Personally, I haven't the least antipathy to him, only a little sadness of heart. When he died, I had my mother come to live with me, and she'd still be with me if she were alive. I've had to dwell on my start in life, since for me it really was the start of everything. I'll get on more quickly now. I came to grips with poverty when I was 18, after an easy life till then. I tried all sorts of jobs, and I didn't do too badly. But my real interest in life was the death penalty. I wanted to square accounts with that poor blind owl in the dock. So I became an agitator, as they say. I didn't want to be pestiferous, that's all. To my mind, the social order around me was based on the death sentence, and by writing the established order, I'd be fighting against murder. That was my view, others had told me so, and I still think that this belief of mine was substantially true. I joined forces with a group of people I then liked, and indeed had never ceased to like. I spent many years in close cooperation with them, and there's not a country in Europe in whose struggles I haven't played a part. But that's another story. Needless to say, I knew that we too, on occasion, passed sentences of death. But I was told that these few deaths were inevitable for the building up of a new world in which murder would cease to be. That also was true up to a point, and maybe I'm not capable of standing fast when that order of truths is concerned. Whatever the explanation, I hesitated. But then I remembered that miserable owl in the dock, and it enabled me to keep on. Until the day when I was present at an execution, it was in Hungary, and exactly the same dazed horror that I'd experienced as a youngster made everything real before my eyes. Have you ever seen a man shot by a firing squad? No, of course not. The spectators are hand-picked, and it's like a private party. You need an invitation. The result is that you've gleaned your ideas about it from books and pictures. A post, a blindfolded man, some soldiers in the offing. But the real thing isn't a bit like that. Do you know that the firing squad stand only 1.5 yards from the condemned man? Do you know that if the victim took 2 steps forward, his chest would touch the rifles? Do you know that, at this short range, the soldiers concentrate their fire on the region of the heart, and their big bullets make a hole into which you could thrust your fist? No, you didn't know all that. Those are things that are never spoken of. For the plague-stricken, their peace of mind is more important than a human life. Decent folks must be allowed to sleep easy o' nights, mustn't they? Really, it would be shockingly bad taste to linger on such details. That's common knowledge. But personally, I've never been able to sleep well since then. The bad taste remained in my mouth, and I've kept lingering on the details, brooding over them. And thus I came to understand that I, anyhow, had had plague through all those long years in which, paradoxically enough, I believed with all my soul that I was fighting it. I learned that I had had an indirect hand in the deaths of thousands of people, that I'd even brought about their deaths by approving of acts and principles which could only end that way. Others did not seem embarrassed by such thoughts, or anyhow never voiced them of their own accord. But I was different. What I'd come to know stuck in my gorge. I was with them, and yet I was alone. When I spoke of these matters, they told me not to be so squeamish. I should remember what great issues were at stake. And they advanced arguments, often quite impressive ones, to make me swallow what nonetheless I couldn't bring myself to stomach. I replied that the most eminent of the plague-stricken, the men who wear red robes, also have excellent arguments to justify what they do. And once I admitted the arguments of necessity and force majeure put forward by the less eminent, I couldn't reject those of the eminent. To which they retorted that the surest way of playing the game of the red robes was to leave them to the monopoly of the death penalty. My reply to this was that if you give in once, there was no reason for not continuing to give in. It seems to me that history has borne me out. Today there's a sort of competition who will kill the most. They're all mad over murder, and they can't stop killing men even if they wanted to. In any case, my concern was not with arguments. It was with the poor owl, with that foul procedure whereby dirty mouth stinking of plague told a fettered man that he was going to die, and scientifically arranged things so that he should die, after nights and nights of mental torture, while he waited to be murdered in cold blood. My concern was with that hole in a man's chest, and I told myself that, meanwhile, so far anyhow as I was concerned, nothing in the world would induce me to accept any argument that justified such butcheries. Yet I chose to blindly obstinate, pending the day when I could see my way more clearly. I'm still of the same mind. For many years I've been ashamed, mortally ashamed, of having been, even with the best intentions, even at many removes, a murderer in my turn. As time went on, I merely learned that even those who were better than the rest could not keep themselves nowadays from killing or letting others kill, because such is the logic by which they live. And that we can't stir a finger in this world without the risk of bringing death to somebody. Yes, I've been ashamed ever since. I have realized that we all have plague, and I have lost my peace. And today I'm still trying to find it, still trying to understand all those others and not to be the mortal enemy of anyone. I only know that one must do what one can do to cease being plague-stricken, and that's the only way in which we can hope for some peace, failing that, a decent death. This, and only this, can bring relief to men, and if not save them, at least do them the least possible harm, and even sometimes a little good. So that is why I resolved to have no truck with anything which, directly or indirectly, for good reasons or for bad, brings death to anyone or justifies others putting him to death. That, too, is why this epidemic has taught me nothing new, except that I must fight it at your side. I know positively, yes, Ryu, I can say I know the world inside out, as you may see, that each of us has the plague within him. No one on earth is free from it. And I know, too, that we must keep endless watch on ourselves lest in a careless moment we breathe in someone's face and fasten the infection on him. What's natural is the microbe. All the rest, health, integrity, purity if you like, is a product of the human will, of a vigilance that must never falter. The good man, the man who infects hardly anyone, is the man who has the fewest lapses of attention. And it needs tremendous willpower, a never-ending tension of the mind, to avoid such lapses. Yes, Ryu, it's a wearing business being plague-stricken, but it's still more wearing to refuse to be it. That's why everybody in the world today looks so tired. Everyone is more or less sick of the plague. But that is also why some of us, those who want to get the plague out of their systems, feel such desperate weariness, a weariness from which nothing remains to set us free except death. Pending that release, I know I have no place in the world of today. Once I definitely refused to kill, I doomed myself to an exile that can never end. I leave it to others to make history. I know, too, that I'm not qualified to pass judgment on those others. There's something lacking in my mental makeup, and its lack prevents me from being a rational murderer. So it's a deficiency, not a superiority. But as things are, I'm willing to be as I am. I've learned modesty. All I maintain is that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims. And it's up to us, so far as possible, not to join forces with the pestilences. This may sound simple to the point of childlessness. I can't judge if it's simple, but I know it's true. You see, I've heard such quantities of arguments, which very nearly turned my head, and turned other people's heads enough to make them approve of murder. And I'd come to realize that all our troubles spring from our failure to use plain, clean-cut language. So I resolved always to speak, and to act, quite clearly, as this was the only way of setting myself on the right track. That's why I say there are pestilences and there are victims, nor more than that. If by making that statement I too become a carrier of the plague germ, at least I don't do it willfully. I try, in short, to be an innocent murderer. You see, I've no great ambitions. I grant we should add a third category, that of true healers. But it's a fact one doesn't come across many of them, and anyhow it must be a hard vocation. That's why I decided to take, in every predicament, the victim's side, so as to reduce the damage done. Among them, I can at least try to discover how one attains to the third category. In other words, to peace. Taro was swinging his leg, tapping the terrace lightly with his heel, as he concluded. After a short silence, the doctor raised himself a little in his chair, and asked if Taro had an idea of the path to follow for attaining peace. Yes, he replied. The path of sympathy. 2 ambulances were clanging in the distance. The dispersed shouts they had been hearing off and on drew together on the outskirts of the town, near the stony hill, and presently there was a sound like a gunshot. Then silence fell again. Ryu counted 2 flashes of the revolving light. The breeze freshened, and a gust coming from the sea filled the air for a moment with the smell of brine. And at the same time, they clearly heard the low sound of waves lapping the foot of the cliffs. It comes to this, Taro said, almost casually. What interests me is learning how to become a saint. But you don't believe in God. Exactly. Can one be a saint without God? That's the problem. In fact, the only problem I'm up against today. A sudden blaze sprang up above the place where shouts had come from, and, stemming the wind stream, a rumor of many voices came to their ears. The blaze died down almost at once, leaving behind it only a dull red glow. Then, in a break of the wind, they distinctly heard some strident yells in the discharge of a gun, followed by the roar of an angry crowd. Taro stood up and listened, but nothing more could be heard. Another skirmish at the gates, I suppose. Well, it's over now, Ryu said. Taro said in a low voice that it was never over, and there would be more victims, because that was in the order of things. Perhaps, the doctor answered. But you know, I feel more fellowship with the defeated than with saints. Heroism and sanctity don't really appeal to me, I imagine. What interests me is being a man. Yes, we're both after the same thing, but I'm less ambitious. Ryu supposed Taro was jesting, and turned to him with a smile. But, faintly lit by the dim radiance falling from the sky, the face he saw was sad and earnest. There was another gust of wind, and Ryu felt it warm on his skin. Taro gave himself a little shake. Do you know, he said, what we now should do for friendship's sake? Anything you like, Taro. Go for a swim. It's one of those harmless pleasures that even a saint-to-be can indulge in, don't you agree? Ryu smiled again, and Taro continued. With our passes, we can get out on the pier. Really, it's too damn silly living only in and for the plague. Of course, a man should fight for the victims, but if he ceases caring for anything outside that, what's the use of his fighting? Right, Ryu said. Let's go. Some minutes later, the car drew up at the harbor gates. The moon had risen, and a milk-white radiance, dappled with shadows, lay around them. Behind them rose the town, tier on tier, and from it came warm, fetid breaths of air that urged them toward the sea. After showing their passes to a guard, who inspected them minutely, they crossed some open ground littered with casks, and headed toward the pier. The air here reeked of stale wine and fish. Just before they reached the pier, a smell of iodine and seaweed announced the nearest of the sea, and they clearly heard the sound of waves breaking gently on the big stone blocks. Once they were on the pier, they saw the sea spread out before them, a gently heaving expanse of deep-piled velvet, supple and sleek as a creature of the wild. They sat down on a boulder facing the open. Slowly the waters rose and sank, and with their tranquil breathing, sudden oily glints formed and flickered over the surface of a haze of broken lights. Before them the darkness stretched out into infinity. Ryu could feel under his hand the gnarled, weather-worn visage of the rocks, and a strange happiness possessed him. Turning to Taro, he caught a glimpse of his friend's face of the same happiness, a happiness that forgot nothing, not even murder. They undressed, and Ryu dived in first. After the first shock of cold had passed, and he came back to the surface, the water seemed tepid. When he had taken a few strokes, he found that the sea was warm that night, with the warmth of autumn seas that borrow from the shore the accumulated heat of the long days of summer. The movement of his feet left a foaming wake as he swam steadily ahead, and the water slipped along his arms to close in tightly on his legs. A loud splash told him that Taro had dived. Ryu lay on his back and stayed motionless, gazing up at the dome of sky lit by the stars and moon. He drew a deep breath. Then he heard a sound of beaten water, louder and louder, amazingly clear in the hollow silence of the night. Taro was coming up with him. He now could hear his breathing. Ryu turned and swam level with his friend, timing his stroke to Taro's. But Taro was the stronger swimmer, and Ryu had to put on speed to keep up with him. For some minutes they swam side by side, with the same zest, the same rhythm, isolated from the world, at last free of the town and of the plague. Ryu was the first to stop, and they swam back slowly, except one point, where unexpectedly they found themselves caught in an ice-cold current. Their energy whipped up by the trap the sea had sprung on them, both struck out more vigorously. They dressed and started back. Neither had said a word, but they were conscious of being perfectly at one, and the memory of this night would be cherished by them both. When they caught sight of the plague watchman, Ryu guessed that Taro, like himself, was thinking that the disease had given them a respite, and this was good, but now they must set their shoulders to the wheel again. Yes, the plague gave them short shrift indeed, and they must set their shoulders to the wheel again. Throughout December, it smoldered in the chests of our townsfolk, fed the fires in the crematorium, and peopled the camps with human jetsam. In short, it never ceased progressing with its characteristically jerky but unfaltering stride. The authorities had optimistically reckoned on the coming of winter to halt its progress, but it lasted through the first cold spells without the least remission, so the only thing for us to do was to go on waiting. And since after a too long waiting one gives up waiting, the whole town lived as if it had no future. As for Dr. Ryu, that brief hour of peace and friendship which had been granted him was not, and could not be, repeated. Yet another hospital had been opened, and his only converse was with his patients. However, he noticed a change at this stage of the epidemic, now that the plague was assuming more and more the pneumonic form. The patients seemed, after their fashion, to be seconding the doctor. Instead of giving way to the prostration or the frenzies of the earlier period, they appeared to have a cleaner idea of where their instincts lay, and on their own initiative asked for what might be the most beneficial. Thus they were always clamoring for something to drink, and insisted on being kept as warm as possible. And though the demands on him were as exhausting as before, Ryu no longer had the impression of putting up a solitary fight. The patients were cooperating. Toward the end of December, he received a letter from M. Othen, who was still in quarantine. The magistrate stated that his quarantine period was over. Unfortunately, the date of his admission to camp seemed to have been mislaid by the secretariat, and if he was still detained, it was certainly due to a mistake. His wife, recently released from quarantine, had gone to the prefect's office to protest and had been rudely treated. They had told her that the office never makes mistakes. Ryu asked Rambert to look into the matter, and a few days later M. Othen called on him. There had, in fact, been a mistake, and Ryu showed some indignation. But M. Othen, who had grown thinner, raised a limp, and a depreciating hand, weighed his words. He said that everyone can make mistakes. And the doctor thought to himself that, decidedly, something had changed. "What will you do now, Monsieur Othen?" Ryu asked. "I suppose you have a pile of work awaiting you." "Well, as a matter of fact, I'm putting in for some leave." "I quite understand. You need a rest." "It's not that. I want to go back to the camp." Ryu couldn't believe his ears. "But you've only just come out of it." "I'm afraid I did not make myself clear. I'm told there are some voluntary workers from governmental offices in that camp." The magistrate rolled his round eyes a little and tried to smooth down a tuft of hair. "It would keep me busy, you see. And also, I know it may sound absurd, but I'd feel less separated from my little boy." Ryu stared at him. Could it be that a sudden gentleness showed in those hard, inexpressive eyes? Yes, they had grown misted, lost their steely glitter. "Certainly," Ryu said. "Since that's your wish, I'll fix it up for you." The doctor kept his word, and the life of the plague-ridden town resumed its course until Christmas. Taro continued to bring his quiet efficiency to bear on every problem. Rambert confided in the doctor that, with the covenants of the two young guards, he was sending letters to his wife, and now and then receiving an answer. He suggested to Ryu that he should avail himself on this clandestine channel, and Ryu agreed to do so. For the first time for many months, he sat down to write a letter. He found it a laborious business, as if he were manipulating a language that had been forgotten. The letter was dispatched. The reply was slow in coming. As for Cotard, he was prospering, making money hand over fist in small, somewhat shady transactions. With Grand, however, it was otherwise. The Christmas season did not seem to agree with him. Indeed, Christmas that year had none of its old-time associations. It smacked of hell rather than of heaven. Empty, unlighted shops, dummy chocolates or empty boxes in the confectioner's windows. Streetcars laden with listless, dispirited passengers. All was as unlike previous Christmas-tides as it well could be. In the past, all the townspeople, rich and poor alike, indulged in seasonal festivity. Now only a privileged few, those with the money to burn, could do so, and they caroused in shamefast solitude in a dingy backshop or a private room. In the churches, there were more supplications than carols. You saw a few children, too young to realize what threatened them, playing in the frosty, cheerless streets, but no one dared to bid them welcome in the God of former days, bringer of gifts as old as human sorrow, yet new as the hopes of youth. There was no room in any heart but for very old, grey hope. That hope that keeps men from letting themselves drift into death and is nothing but a dogged will to live. Grand had failed to show up as usual on the previous evening. Feeling somewhat anxious, Ryu called at his place early in the morning, but he wasn't at home. His friends were asked to keep a lookout for him. At about 11, Rambert came to the hospital with the news that he'd seen a distant glimpse of Grand, who seemed to be wandering aimlessly, looking very queer. Unfortunately, he had lost sight of him almost at once. Tarot and the doctor set out in the car to hunt for Grand. At noon, Ryu stepped out of his car into the frozen air. He had just caught sight of Grand some distance away, his face glued to a shop window full of crudely carved wooden toys. Tears were steadily flowing down the old fellow's cheeks, and they wrung the doctor's heart, for he could understand them, and he felt his own tears welling up in sympathy. A picture rose before him of that scene long ago, the youngster standing in front of another shop window, like this one, dressed for Christmas, and Jian turning toward him in a sudden access of emotion and saying how happy she was. He could guess that through the mists of the past years, from the depths of his fond despair, Jian's young voice was rising, echoing in Grand's ears. And he knew, also, what the old man was thinking as his tears flowed, and he, Ryu, thought it too. That a loveless world is a dead world, and always there comes an hour when one is weary of prisons, of one's work, and of devotion to duty, and all one cares for is a loved face, the warmth and wonder of a loving heart. Grand saw the doctor's reflection in the window. Still weeping, he turned and, leaning against the shop front, watched Ryu approach. "Oh, doctor! Doctor!" He could say no more. Ryu, too, couldn't speak. He made a vague, understanding gesture. At this moment, he suffered with Grand's sorrow, and what filled his breast was the passionate indignation we felt when confronted by all the anguish men share. "Yes, Grand," he murmured. "Oh, if only I could have time to write to her, to let her know, and to let her be happy without remorse." Almost roughly, Ryu took Grand's arm and drew him forward. Grand did not resist and went on muttering broken phrases. "Too long, it's last too long. All the time one's wanting to let oneself go. And then one day one has to. Oh, doctor, I know I look a quiet sort, just like anybody else. But it's always been a terrible effort only to be just normal. And now, even that's too much for me." He stopped dead. He was trembling violently, his eyes were fever bright. Ryu took his hand. It was burning hot. "You must go home." But Grand wrenched himself free and started running. After a few steps, he halted and stretched out his arms, swaying to and fro. Then he spun round on himself and fell flat on the pavement, his face stained with the tears that went on flowing. Some people who were approaching stopped abruptly and watched the scene from a little way off, not daring to come nearer. Ryu had to carry the old man to the car. Grand lay in bed, gasping for breaths. His lungs were congested. Ryu pondered. The old fellow hadn't any family. What would be the point of having him evacuated? He and Tarot could look after him. Grand's head was buried in the pillow. His cheeks were a greenish gray. His eyes had gone dull, opaque. He seemed to be gazing fixedly at the scanty fire Tarot was kindling with the remains of an old packing case. "I'm in a bad way," he muttered. A queer crackling sound came from his flame-seared lungs whenever he tried to speak. Ryu told him not to talk and promised to come back. The sick man's lips parted in a curious smile, and a look of humorous complicity flickered across the haggard face. "If I pull through, doctor, hats off." A moment later, he sank into extreme prostration. Visiting him again a few hours later, they found him half sitting up in bed, and Ryu was horrified by the rapid change that had come over his face, ravaged by the fires of the disease consuming him. However, he seemed more lucid, and almost immediately asked them to get his manuscript from his drawer where he always kept it. When Tarot handed him the sheets, he pressed them to his chest without looking at them, then held them out to the doctor, indicating by a gesture that he was to read them. There was some 50 pages of manuscript. Glancing through them, Ryu saw that the bulk of the writing consisted of the same sentence written again and again with small variants, simplifications, or elaborations. Presently the month of May, the lady on horseback, the avenues of the boy recurred, regrouped in different patterns. Persistently the month of May, the lady on horseback, the avenues of the boy recurred, regrouped in different patterns. There were, besides explanatory notes, some exceedingly long and lists of alternatives. But at the foot of the last page was written in a studiously clear hand, "My dearest Jan, today is Christmas Day, and 8 words only." Above it, in copperplate script, was the latest version of the famous phrase. "Read it," Grand whispered, and Ryu read. "One fine morning in May, a slim young horsewoman might have been seen riding a glossy sorrel mare across the avenues of the Bois among the flowers." "Is that it?" There was a feverish quaver in the old voice. Ryu refrained from looking at him, and he began to toss about in the bed. "Yes, I know. I know what you're thinking. Fine isn't the word, it's—" Ryu clasped his hands under the coverlet. "No, Doctor. It's too late. No time." His breast heaved painfully, and then suddenly he said in a loud, shrill voice, "Burn it!" The doctor hesitated, but Grand repeated his injunction in so violent a tone, and with such agony in his voice, that Ryu walked across to the fireplace and dropped the sheets on the dying fire. It blazed up, and there was a sudden flood of light, a fleeting warmth in the room. After injecting the serum, Ryu whispered to his friends that Grand wouldn't last the night, and Taro volunteered to stay with him. The doctor approved. All night Ryu was haunted by the idea of Grand's death. But next morning, he found his patient sitting up in bed, talking to Taro. His temperature was down to normal, and there were no symptoms other than a generalized prostration. "Yes, doctor," Grand said. "I was over-hasty. But I'll make another start. You see, I can remember every word." Ryu looked at Taro dubiously. "We will wait," he said. But at noon there was no change. By nightfall, Grand could be considered out of danger. Ryu was completely baffled by this resurrection. Other surprises were in store for him. About the same time, there was brought to the hospital a girl whose case Ryu diagnosed as hopeless, and he had sent her immediately to the isolation ward. She was delirious and had all the symptoms of pneumonic plague. Next morning, however, the temperature had fallen. As in Grand's case, the doctor assumed this was the ordinary morning fall that his experience had taught him to regard as a bad sign. But at noon, the temperature still showed no rise, and at night it went up only a few degrees. Next morning it was down to normal. Though very exhausted, the girl was breathing freely. Ryu remarked to Taro that her recovery was against all the rules. But in the course of the next week, 4 similar cases came to his notice. The old asthma patient was bubbling over with excitement when Ryu and Taro visited him at the end of the week. "Would you ever have believed it? They're coming out again," he said. "Who?" "Why, the rats." Not one dead or living rat had been seen in the town since April. "Does that mean it's starting all over again?" Taro asked Ryu. The old man was rubbing his hands. "You should see him running, Doctor. It's a treat, it is." He himself had seen 2 rats slipping into the house by the street door, and some neighbors, too, had told him they'd seen rats in their basements. In some houses, people had heard those once familiar scratchings and rustlings behind the woodwork. Ryu awaited with much interest the mortality figures that were announced every Monday. They showed a decrease.